Chapter 11 of Rangy Pete by Guy Morton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Somewhere behind them as they rode, Rangy knew, were the hurrying riders of the posse. Far off along this route which Miss Dick had chosen was the tangled land of the Dervishers. All about them were the pyramids of buttes rising up above this magic valley land and throwing into the obscurity of gloom the whole of the world except that one narrow pathway which stretched out clear and crisp in the glow of the moon. The glad light of the moon stole over the rim of the buttes, and it filmed all the air about with a smoky haze which stretched on and on before the eye to even greater distance than ran this silver pathway. The air of night was crisp and cool and dry, with no faint suggestion of the heat of the day. There was in it an exhilaration like the touch of wine. There was a response in the quick surge of blood through the veins of youth. Behind them were the riders of the plains, forgotten for a time beneath the magic spell of the butte lands. Rangy Pete, who had ridden the ranges and the hills through many a strange day and many a stranger night, knew that this silvering touch of the moon painted the iron of the buttes in its most caressing mood. He knew that never could nature come nearer to bowing before the sentiments of man, and because of that knowledge he glanced over at the silent figure of the girl at his side. Perhaps Miss Dick felt something of the same softening touch of the hills, for abruptly she swept off her sombrero, and she rode on silently through the night, with the stray wisps of her hair floating out to catch something of the shimmer of the moonlight. Rangy Pete rode just as silently, wondering at the picture of her as she sat her cayuse with all the superb ease of a careless boy, as the moonbeams toyed about her and tried to paint out for the time being all the drab days of her past. As she rode there so silently, with the magic of the solemn hills, of the deep mysterious shadows, of the glad glimmering moon, thrown out as a giant stagery about her, Rangy Pete found it hard to believe that this boyish figure, with its quietly solemn face, was the same Miss Dick against whom he had been compelled to declare war. Along the winding pathway of the butte lands, through deep patches of night-cooled shadow which by day would be burning to the touch, through the open boulder-strewn glades where the moonlight glimmered and mingled with the haze of night, following the twisting course of the draw, up sharp grades and down into the mystery of blackened valleys over which the hesitating haze of night hung like a film cloud, Rangy Pete made his way, still at the side of Miss Dick the bandit. At times, as they climbed out of some darkened valley through the film of night, as their heads rose up through the vaporish aura which circled over these hill-pocketed valleys, as they came up near the crest of some butte and looked down upon the whole world dancing away before them in the arms of the moonlight, Rangy Pete felt something of the poignant beauty of living. It would be wonderful to wander on and on like this forever, to forget that there was a great world out beyond this magic land of night, to forget that in these same hills there were burning days, to remember only the present with its instant joys. Rangy shrugged his shoulders sharply. If only one could forget the past and the inevitable future. In that moment of temptation, a trace of anger came to his brain. Why should he care about the petty deeds of the world? Life was a gift thrust unasked into the hands of every man, a prize to be lived to the ultimate, or a bauble to be cast aside. So what mattered to him the tiny life of Triple Butte, or of the plains beyond, as long as there were trails such as this to be ridden at night, with a girl like this whose floating wisps of hair could shine so gloriously in the moonlight? Rangy Pete was still pondering that point when Miss Dick, looking along the moonlit trail ahead to a point where it dipped sharply into the shadows, abruptly broke the long silence. "Has it occurred to you to wonder just where I am taking you?" she asked suddenly. "Does it matter?" Rangy Pete replied with the mystery of the night still upon him. "That is for you to say," Miss Dick returned, quite without emotion. "A few hours ago you seemed angered at the mere thought of joining the Dervishers. Even the suggestion seemed to touch you upon a raw spot. Does your answer mean that you have changed your mind?" "Not as long as I got a mind of my own," Rangy returned. "Then you really are quite simple after all," Miss Dick went on with calm emphasis, "and it does matter where I happen to be taking you. Suppose I should tell you that we passed a Dervisher camp in the last valley, that there is another in the valley immediately ahead, that there is no way out of this trail but forward or back, and that all I need to do to bring a swarm of men about me is to fire off my revolver. What happens then to your boast to take me out to Triple Butte? You know there are men among the Dervishers who would jump to do anything I ask, big or small." "An' a bit of shootin' would look small to them," Rangy suggested. Miss Dick seemed temporarily angered. She remained in silence while they passed through the darkened valley, while they climbed its ridge and on into a series of valleys and hills beyond. "What I mean is, how do you know I am not leading you into the Dervisher camp?" she asked at length. "There are any number of men there who would "That's what I'm hopin' you'll do," Rangy returned imperturbably. "Since you been a talkin' to me about that $10,000 in gold, I been doin' some thinkin', an' I agree with you, Miss, that I otta take that money back with me when we go into Triple Butte. So, Miss, if it ain't askin' too much of you, I'd shore be obliged if you'd lead the way to the Dervisher camp and show me where they got that 10,000 cached." "What would you do with it if you got your fingers on it in an easy way like that?" Miss Dick demanded. "Same as if I got it in a hard way, er by havin' to shoot a couple of persons. It's all the same to me. It'd have to go back to the person it belongs to, an' that happens to be Rough House Dan Merrill. They ain't no fun handin' 10,000 of anythin' over to Dan Merrill, 'less they happens to be lead coated, but seein' 'at it was Merrill's stuff you hadda go and steal, they ain't nothin' for it but to give it back to him." Rangy's dissertation was interrupted by a low but mocking ripple of laughter. Coincidentally, Miss Dick spurred her cayuse forward for a few rapid strides, until she led the way, with Rangy Pete some paces behind. Then she slackened to their old pace, but she did not look backward. Even through the moonlight, Rangy could be quite sure that the ripple of laughter had grown in its dimensions, and that there was something in the situation which had a strongly humorous appeal to Miss Dick. Through the traveling of some paces, Rangy wondered just where was the foundation for humor. Then abruptly, from a sidling fling of the girl's head, he knew. Miss Dick did not believe him. She did not credit the seriousness of his intentions, so far as that $10,000 were concerned. She regarded it simply as a crude attempt to get possession of the spoils. Because of the iron teaching of the butte land, she was incapable, perhaps, of appreciating that man could do the thing which he had planned to do. For a time the pity of that seemed to rob the moonlight of some of its glory, but it did not rob Miss Dick of any of her outward appeal. As she rode on now through the brilliant patches and through the deep shadows, a light, careless air of brigandage came to her lips. She hummed it with the free spirit of one without care, and to Rangy Pete, riding in the background, it seemed that for the time being she had forgotten all about him and his problem. The pity of it! For Miss Dick, under other conditions, would have been one of the desires of the world. He was conscious of the free, youthful grace, the abandon of her, as she rode on ahead, singing a song of the piracy of the hills, scorning the conventions of man, and mocking the good within him as being nothing but a tawdry strain. Though the girl's voice was low, it came to him clearly through the night air, with a taunting texture in its notes, with laughter almost at the surface of the words. There was a poise to her head, he could see, which was more mocking even than the laughter, but there was nothing about Miss Dick which robbed her of any of the appeal of her moonlit beauty. Curse her! A wonderfully young and virile thing, humanly appealing, alluring, yet accursed with the sin of the butte lands, drawing him away inch by inch from the strength of his purpose. He had been right days ago when he had told himself that within her fair and appealing body there was a vampirish soul created for man's destruction. No, he would not have it so. She was not luring him away from his purpose, she was goading him on to do his duty. Rangy Pete spurred his cayuse almost angrily, and he rode up beside the girl. She glanced at him carelessly, but the lilt of song did not drop from her lips. Something prompted Rangy to wait until long after the song was finished, so that in the end it was the girl who spoke first. "I am half inclined to take you to the gold, to show it to you, and then see what happens," she declared suddenly, with an air which hinted at strange possibilities for the future, with a definite sporting spirit which implied that the incident could not be without its human interest. To her it would be a game. "Mabbe you don't like the Dervishers, er perhaps you got a big spite against them," Rangy returned easily. "There are some I could see rubbed out," the girl returned, as she caught the meaning of his taunt. Then abruptly her thoughts seemed to drift away. "If they's to be a reception party, I wouldn't advise you none to have any friends among them present." Rangy interrupted Miss Dick's mood. "This is just a li'l tip I'm handin' to you, Miss, so any time you wants to run on ahead and kinda herd yore friends outa the way, you just let me know." Miss Dick glanced at him sharply, with a flash in her eyes, but Rangy Pete could see that there was irresolution upon her features, which she tried to conceal, but which for the moment was the most compelling phase of her. So she was still wavering. She could not understand him, Rangy Pete, than whom in his own esteem there was no easier person in the whole world to understand. His life as he viewed it now had been simple and direct, in its loves as well as in its hates, in its words as well as in its acts, while hers, God only knew what strange weavings of complexities the iron of the buttes and the teachings of brigandage had builded into her. Still, it did seem to be his place to help her to understand. "Miss Dick," he resumed, "they shore looks to be some big thoughts a troublin' themselves in that head of yours. So I'm gonna tell you one or two things what mabbe'll help you to get a rope on them unruly ideas. What I want you to know is that when I say I'm gonna do a thing, I do it. I allus say what I mean, near's I can find the words to say it. And the worst little thought you got in yore head at this minute is the one that mabbe I'm tryin' to put somethin' over you about that 10,000. Miss Dick, you can take it from me, I wouldn't touch that 10,000 with a 100-foot lariat if I hadn't come to see that it's just as much my job to get that money back as it is to take you into Triple Butte. I'm thankin' you, Miss, for remindin' me about the 10,000. Mabbe it ain't easy for a bandit to understand, Miss, but I'm wantin' you to know that I ain't had enough trainin' to be able to look in more'n one direction at once, and they ain't room in my head for more'n one big idea at a time. When you get that rounded up, mabbe you'll see that the only thing for you to do is to show me that 10,000, and then come back to Triple Butte peaceable like." Again Miss Dick looked at Rangy Pete, and she studied his face calmly through the moonlight. This time there was no suggestion of laughter or mockery in her manner. There was, instead, a demand to know the truth. But back of her eagerness to understand, Rangy was conscious of the working of some inbred vein of suspicion. That, of course, was the result of her life among the Dervishers. For the moment, as he thought of that, a touch of pity came to his eyes. Pity in his eyes, a sharp flash of anger upon the face of the girl. Promptly Miss Dick spurred her cayuse forward, and she raced on through the alternate light and shadow of the butte land. The quick, impetuous mood of her! So she had given him her answer. She would not ride back to Triple Butte in peace. It was for him now to follow her, to camp upon her trail through the long days and nights, to come up with her again sometime in the future, and then, when he found her, to teach to her that code of mankind. Rangy rode silently through the night, with the problem upon him, and with a strange and new gnawing of pain about the heart. It was queer how the magic and the charm should have fled from the mellowness of the moonlight. It was strange how these buttes should become nothing but drab sentinels peering into the night. And it was stranger still how the thought of Miss Dick, the bandit, should bring to his brain the keen thrill of promise and the deep torment of despair, like the flashing and vanishing of some ultimate prize before the eyes. Through the night he rode, with the pangs and the promise of the future in constant conflict within him. And then, when a vague restlessness among the shadings of the eastern sky warned him of brilliant sunrise, he came to a dividing point in the trail. One draw angled to the north, the other to the south, towards the pass which marked the last barrier of the Dervishers before one came to that tangle of hills and valleys beyond. Rangy dismounted and studied the trail carefully. A moment later he shook his head in a worried way at the burnt yellow cayuse. Miss Dick, by turning to the north, would have avoided all those stray riders who had been strung out through the butte land for days now in search for Dervishers. She would have avoided all those Snaky Y punchers who had gone south the night before in search for him. To the north lay freedom, unhampered and untrammeled. To the south lay the full menace which the butte land could draw unto itself. To the south lay the clearer, untangled trails where man, caught between the impassable barriers of the cliffs, would be trapped helplessly and hopelessly between whatever forces chose to press upon him. And Miss Dick had turned to the south. The strange, unreadable whim of her! For the girl must have known that those southern trails, being closer to Triple Butte than was this northern pass, must already be peopled with the stray posses from the Snaky Y, and with the venom of their purpose. Rangy Pete's brow grew furrowed as he looked into the south through the growing sunlight, and as he thought of the dangers which lay along the trail which Miss Dick had taken, dangers for her and for him. Then he shaded his eyes and peered back along the draw he had just ridden. Back there, thrown up clearly against the sharpening rays of the sun, were the jagged rock and the rugged outline of crude cliffs. Back there the trail rose and fell, and yes, back along that sun-splayed draw there were tiny black shadows crawling along through the morning light. Black shadows which wove and twisted their way among the boulders, shadows which toiled and which, even as he looked, drew slowly towards him. Again the furrow came to Rangy's brow, and the swift glance which he swept over the butte land was one almost of angered protest. Behind him was the posse which had dogged him all through the previous day. In it would be Dan Merrill, smarting under the many lashes which had scourged him of late, but smarting most of all because of the loss of $10,000 in gold. In Merrill's heart there would be but the one burning purpose of revenge. And at Merrill's back there were a score at least of those creeping black shadows which in time would turn into men keen to do the other's bidding. To the north lay freedom, undoubted and undisputed. To the south, here at his very feet, was the mouth of that draw which was the neck of a bottle pointing towards the trap of the butte lands. Miss Dick had ridden into it, calmly and uncaring. As for himself, again that burning about the heart, that cry of pity in his brain, that demand that he see once more the blue well of light which shone down into her unreadable soul. With a gesture of impatience, Rangy Pete slapped the astonished cayuse with his sombrero, and he rode swiftly and surely down the storm-tossed trail to the south, into the vast and vague hours of the unknown future. For off there, in the uncharted spaces of time and place, the call of the bandit girl was luring him. End of chapter 11. Chapter 12 of Rangy Pete by Guy Morton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Into the neck of the bottle which was the trap of the butte lands rode Rangy Pete, conscious as he rode of the net which must be weaving about him. To the north, that way lay freedom, with the open trails ahead. To the south, somewhere along this trail he was now threading, or in the Pelican draw, or in the draws beyond, there must be the keen riders of the Snaky Y, spurred on by the savagery of Dan Merrill. In the whole logical summary of events, there could be nothing less. He, to all practical purposes, was the bandit who had stolen that $10,000 in gold, and he, being now an outcast, would be the just victim of any rider from the Snaky Y. And unless Merrill were utterly devoid of reason, these draws to the south, leading through to the pass and to the land of the Dervishers, must have been blocked hours ago. Yet behind him, to the north, lay freedom. After that one swift decision, Rangy gave those trails to the north barely a thought, for it was the lure of Miss Dick, the bandit, which was dragging him on, the lure and the consciousness that the dangers into which he was riding so confidently could be no less vital and poignant to her. Through the day he rode, over the tumble of hills and valley, past the pyramids of gray rocks and the sentinels of turret tips, climbing slowly but steadily through the unpitying light of the sun, which poured its searching rays over the butte land. Slowly that trail climbed upward as it twisted and wound its way about the pyramids and turrets of rock. For great stretches the whole trail, both forward and back, was lost completely to view. At times it hid behind the turrets of the buttes. Again it lay within their shadow. But always, whenever the clear stretches of world lay behind him, he could see those crawling black shadows which seemed to grow larger with the passing of the hours. "They're gaining, boy," Rangy informed the uncaring cayuse. "You've had a bit too much work to do these past days." With that consciousness upon him, and the full knowledge of its significance, Rangy Pete kept his mind upon the future and his eyes upon the trail before him. For off there, Miss Dick must eventually ride into the ranks of the punchers, unless perchance she really knew what she was doing after all. Through some minutes that thought startled him. Could it be possible that the girl was riding to the rendezvous of the Dervishers somewhere to the east of the pass, and that in their numbers she would find safety? For a time that startled him. Then it soothed. Then it brought fresh anxiety. For Miss Dick among the Dervishers would be lost to him more completely than as though the butte lands had swallowed her up. With this anxiety upon him, Rangy watched sharply the dun spaces of the forward trail. And because of that he made his discovery, in the advance of the afternoon when the rays of the sun were already slanting and were biting with duller tongues. It was simply some dark object lying in the center of the trail. Rangy checked the cayuse suddenly. A gauntlet lying there before him. A gauntlet fringed at the edge, and therefore some woman's toy. And to whom could it belong other than Miss Dick? But why should the girl's glove be here in the middle of the trail? Rangy dismounted and picked up the gauntlet, and the feel of it brought a grin to his lips. It would be a memento to return to her sometime in the near or far off future. It would... Rangy's fingers contracted in astonishment, for between their tips was some hard metallic substance, caught within the folds of the gauntlet. Swiftly he shook that object loose, and instantly an expression of amusement flashed over his features, for that metallic substance was nothing less than a gold coin. Part of Merrill's 10,000, of course. But what should it be doing here? Rangy's eyes roved quickly about the tumbled landscape before him, but within the limit of their gaze there was nothing but the drab, sun-baked walls of the cliffs and this jumble of rock which littered the trail. But no, there was more than that. There was this scarred face of the trail where the hoofs of many horses had flayed it. Miss Dick had been held up. That was plain now to an intelligence trained to reading the significance of small things. Held up by punchers or by her own Dervishers? It was no more than he had feared. Yet now, with its surety upon him, a sudden flush of anger mottled his cheeks. Anger towards any person who dared to challenge the pathway of Miss Dick. For a time Rangy walked about the rock-strewn trail, and this action eased the fever of his brain until he was able to laugh at his own folly. Then he returned to the burnt yellow cayuse and resumed the trail, more slowly, more cautiously than before. That glove, he could see now through his saner moments, might mean any one of many things. It might be a taunt, it might be a warning, it might be a cry for help. Towards the waning of the afternoon he came to the divide where this trail ran into the Pelican draw. From that time forward he moved more swiftly. The Pelican, he feared, must be peopled with many riders, and now the urge was upon him to see who were those riders with Miss Dick, and to learn if that message of the gauntlet were an appeal or a taunt. For an hour he rode thus, until in time the whole world about him began to change. until the barrenness of the buttes gave way grudgingly to a stunted tree growth which seemed to spring out of the bare face of the rock itself. As he rode, he climbed ever higher, until at length he rounded a sharp rock in the draw, and there he pulled the cayuse to its haunches with a startled jerk at the reins. "Gosh A'mighty!" he exclaimed. "You shore been doing good work, yellow boy." For there, in front of him, toiling up the opposite slope, were four riders. There could be no doubt that one of them was Miss Dick, riding away from him, towards the Pass. That, according to the writing of the plains, could mean but the one thing, that those three strange riders were Dervishers, and that the girl, in riding into the trap of the butte lands, had ridden with intent and in full knowledge of her motives. Rangy became more than ever convinced of that as the minutes dragged away into an hour, and as those four riders continued their steady tramp towards the retreat beyond the Pass. Through that hour he trailed them, though circumstances compelled him to keep such a discreet distance between them that he was able to read but little meaning into their actions, other than that they were Dervishers making their way into the safety zone of those forested hills which lay beyond the rim of the buttes. During that hour he came to the juncture of the Pelican and the Arrowhead trails. The latter draw was a narrow one, ambling in from the direction of the Double K and the Triangle O ranches, and like so many of its brethren, it linked up with the Pelican on this main route through to the Pass. But the Arrowhead, Rangy Pete knew, was the last of those converging trails which bore down upon this one, cut through the southern buttes, so that a man caught between this juncture point and the Pass would become the easy victim to those who had trapped him. There was a price which could be taken, of course, but in this moment of crisis, with the lure of Miss Dick upon him, there was nothing in the price of battle which could equal one glimpse of her oval cheeks. Yet was it a trap after all? The calm and confident manner in which those four Dervishers made their unhurried way towards the Pass would seem to indicate that they had but little to fear. Could it be possible that the posses of the Snaky Y and of Triple Butte had not yet reached this point, and that accordingly the route was clear all the way through to the forests beyond? The attitude of those four Dervishers would imply that. Still, the northern trail which he and Miss Dick had taken from Ike Collander's store was miles farther than the direct journey to Triple Butte, and unless Merrill's brain really had been befuddled by the fumes of anger, this trail should have been blocked hours ago. Rangy dismounted, and with much effort he climbed to an elevated point upon the cliffs from where he could get a vista of the trails behind him. The draw he had just ridden was clear of men or of horses, but Rangy knew there was nothing in that but false security. There were so many sharp dips and sudden valleys and queer turnings that 1,000 men might well be hidden within the range of his eye. But the Arrowhead trail, at the right, ambling listlessly into the Pelican, it stretched out cleaner and less tangled before his gaze, so that from this elevated position he could see its course through long stretches of sunburned trail. For minutes he studied those open areas, with hands shading his eyes, and with his trained gaze studying even the smaller shadows. In the end he uttered an exclamation which was partly approval and partly incomprehension. "Shore," he informed himself, "there's another whole flock of riders coming in the Arrowhead, miles back. But what I can't understand is why they weren't here long ago." Apparently, so far as he could now judge, he was ahead of the pursuing posses. Some strange whim of fate had delayed them. But it did not matter now. The only thing which counted was the fact that chance had brought him safety, and that Miss Dick was off there just a short distance before him, and he felt that if he played the game cautiously, he might get a glimpse of her face once more, in spite of that surrounding bodyguard of Dervishers. At the worst, he could follow them into the land beyond the buttes. When Rangy mounted once more, he rode swiftly, so that a few minutes later, when he rounded a curve in the draw, he was obliged to jerk the burnt yellow cayuse to a slithering halt, for the four Dervishers, in the calmness of their characteristic presumption, had dismounted and were apparently getting ready for a meal and a rest. From the shelter of a rock, Rangy studied the situation before him. The Dervishers had chosen their position well. With a clear stretch of the valley before them, they could see across a long strip of the Pelican draw which they had just traveled, and accordingly would be well warned of the approach of any of those pursuing parties. But doubtless this halt had been chosen because of some queer streak of innate daring. Perhaps it was to draw the pursuit in the direction in which they would have it go. But whatever might be the strange whim of the Dervishers, there was another thing which brought greater torment to Rangy Pete. It was the demand that he should see again the girl who had mocked him. Perhaps chance would show him the way to whisper a few words to tell her that he would never give her up. Perhaps even he might steal her from the shelter of those attending riders. With the thrill of that thought upon him, Rangy studied carefully the formation of the rock of the buttes. A moment later he gave a little exclamation of content, for if he knew anything about butte conformation, the twisting of this trail meant that the draw must almost double back upon itself at a point just a few yards beyond that sentinel tip where the four Dervishers had taken up their stand. Rangy laughed to himself softly. It would be possible for him to climb the cliffs, cross the top of the ledge, and swing down into the Pelican draw at a point past the position of the Dervishers. If he could not approach them from the front across this open valley, he could at least come upon them from their unguarded side, and if perchance Miss Dick... Rangy worked swiftly as he discarded unnecessary equipment, carrying as weapons only his pair of 6-guns and an extra belt of cartridges, and as he climbed the shelving face of the draw. 15 minutes of labor put him at the top, from which point he could look across the thin ridge, and the first glance told him that he had been right, that the trail doubled back upon itself. A quarter of an hour later he was across the ridge, and was looking down upon the draw at a strategic position between the Dervishers and the pass. Slowly, with infinite care, Rangy began the descent. It was difficult, more difficult than the climb had been, so that a full half hour had slipped away before he once more stood in the rocky trail of the draw. The need for haste was upon him now. There had been much lost time, so much that at any minute those four riders might round the corner of the trail. In this instant, with the whole future hanging upon the margin of seconds, Rangy began to appreciate the folly of his undertaking. He was here, cut off, horseless, between the Dervishers and their haunts, with nothing left to him but a pair of derringers and his natural wiles. He must hurry now. He counted the seconds as he ran. Doubtless they would come upon him abruptly, just as he reached that corner of the trail, perhaps before. Perhaps those Dervishers would catch him here in the open of the draw. Rangy ran until he found that his breath was coming in quick, stabbing jerks. This would never do. It left his hand unsteady. So deliberately, with a grip of his will, he slackened his pace, but his eyes never strayed from that turn in the draw around which the drab noses of the Dervisher cayuses might be poked at any second. 100 paces now. 50. There was the rock before him, with the sharp twist in the trail. Rangy's breath came firmer and his hand gained its old iron calm. He threw his sombrero aside, and he peered around the face of the rock. Then a great sigh slipped from his lips. The party of four were not even preparing for the trail. There they were, directly in front of him, 100 yards or more away. Their backs were towards him, and they seemed to be studying the distant slopes of the draw along which they had so recently journeyed. They were watching doubtless for the advancing armies of Triple Butte, waiting to taunt them even as the girl had so lately taunted him. Rangy abruptly found that his fingers were clenching savagely along the butt of his 6-gun. "Jumping mavericks!" he exclaimed under his breath. "There's something wrong." Even at 100 yards distant, Miss Dick's position had seemed at first glance to be too rigid to be natural. But now, he was quite sure of it. Her hands were tied behind her back, and she was tugging slightly at her bonds. Or was she rubbing the rope steadily against the rock? The girl's sombrero was gone. The back of her head was towards him, and he could see that little wisps of her corn silk hair had escaped from their bonds and were floating about her head like a halo. The three men were in front of her, with their backs towards her, and now, when one of them glanced about, the girl stopped that rubbing movement of her hands. Words passed. What they were, Rangy could not say. Then, when the man turned his face away to study the trail once more, the girl resumed that chafing movement of the rope against the rock. In that instant, the flash of a new thought came to Rangy Pete. Could it be possible that the Dervishers had heard of his meeting with Miss Dick at the Crags? Were they punishing her for that? And if so, would it not be for himself they were watching that back trail so patiently? Again Rangy laughed to himself with low, cautious elation. Then the man who had spoken to Miss Dick tossed aside his sombrero, and he shaded his eyes to peer into the east. To Rangy Pete, the silhouette of the man's back, unhatted as he was, seemed somehow vaguely familiar, but he could not place the figure in his memory. Doubtless it would be the same man he had seen in the doorway of Tony Burke's saloon but a few days ago. It would be one of those men who had swaggered. Then the man turned again to speak to Miss Dick, and again the girl's figure drooped. God! The feverish exclamation slipped from Rangy Pete's lips, and he stood for a time staring in bewilderment. The man's profile was towards him now. He could see the outline of the features clearly. He could see the great nose, the sharp chin, the tangled wisp of hair which always fell down over the man's forehead. That wisp of hair, how he hated it. If only he could forget that hatred, for the man's face was not strange to him. Rangy's fingers grew steady and a firm smile came to his lips. That man who was leering now at Miss Dick, whose smile was not the smile which any man should use towards a woman, had a face and a figure which were familiar to him. And the man was not a bandit, such as the rangeman defined the word. It was Bill Sonnes. Sonnes, the right-hand man of Dan Merrill of the Snaky Y. Bill Sonnes, sitting there leering at Miss Dick with an offensive air of possession. Why did he hate the man? Sonnes, who had always been objectionable. Sonnes, who had captured Miss Dick, and who threatened to spoil his, Rangy Pete's, plan to teach the bandit girl that there are codes of mankind which must be respected. Sonnes, with a smirk upon his face, leaning now just a trifle towards the girl, negligently but knowingly. Sonnes, with that ugly big nose and the ragged wisp of hair, smirking, priding himself that he had a way with women. Perhaps he did have a way with Shifty Liz of the Burke saloon, but with this girl, a bandit, whose hands were tied behind her back. Rangy Pete found that it was with an effort that he kept a grip upon himself. If only he could forget that he hated the man's big nose. The presumption of Sonnes, to have taken a captive whom he had reserved for himself. For it was plain that Miss Dick was a captive. Even now, with Sonnes' face turned again to the east, the girl was once more chafing the rope against the rock. She wanted her freedom, that was evident. She had also wanted her freedom from him, and had taken it. But had she regretted it? She had at least thrown that glove upon the trail. In appeal or warning? Yet for Miss Dick, what did it matter whether he or Bill Sonnes were her captor? Nothing, except that with Sonnes it would be a crude enforcement of the law. With himself it would be the exemplification of a code. The two men with Sonnes, with faces turned constantly to the east, were unfamiliar in their pose. Doubtless they would be of the younger clique of the Snaky Y men, perhaps whose mettle had not been tested other than upon the ranges. Tools in the hands of Sonnes, no doubt. Otherwise they would not have held their gaze so steadily upon the east while Sonnes ogled the captive bandit. Abruptly Rangy found himself vaguely wondering. These three men had captured the girl many miles back along the trail. Why had they ridden farther into the butte land, instead of turning back along the route to Triple Butte? It was that which had misled him, which had made him believe they were bandits, but now the answer was plain. They were merely waiting for the belated posses to join them. Miss Dick abruptly stopped the restless movement of her wrists as Sonnes swung about until his leering lips were within a foot of the girl's face. There was a searing fire burning through Rangy's veins. yet through it he was able to summon a grim smile to his lips. Sonnes, the fool, smirking at the bandit girl. It would be almost justice upon Sonnes if Rangy were to step aside. If only he could loosen those bonds about the girl's wrists, and then leave Sonnes to her mercy. Sonnes the ogler, who had a way with women. That would be a fine game to watch. Sonnes against Miss Dick. Sonnes at the mercy of the trickster. Sonnes being warped and twisted, until in the end he did the girl's bidding. Sonnes the smirking fool. Again that hot racing of blood through Rangy's veins. Sonnes with the huge ugly nose, and that brazen legible manner. That distance between them, 100 yards dotted here and there with boulders which perhaps would turn aside an angry bullet. 100 yards, with the backs of 4 people towards him. Another warm surge of blood throbbed in his veins as Sonnes elbowed his way in a languid pose towards the girl. For a moment the blood seemed to burn to his fingertips, and he found there a strange itching to see if he could shoot that 100 yards and kill Bill Sonnes with a single shot. But that would be the crude way. Swiftly, with sudden resolution, Rangy slipped his boots aside. He loosened the 6 guns in either holster, then he dropped to his knees. Slowly, with elaborate care, he began to crawl towards the shadow of the nearest boulder. This was not in line with the course of the draw. So much the better, for it threw him rather more towards Sonnes' back, and less within his line of vision on those occasions when the man smirked at Miss Dick. A false step, the rattling of a fragment of rock, that would mean battle. Battle 3 to 1, with the girl in the line of his fire. For a moment Rangy hesitated. The undertaking, under such conditions, was folly, utter folly. Folly only in case he made that rattling of a rock, or that misstep. Slowly he crept forward again. He hugged the ground, dragging his body snake-like along, brushing from his course every pebble which threatened danger. Sonnes in front of him, leering more persistently now, more confidently, more languid and careless as well as he leaned intimately towards the girl. How the blood surged in Rangy's veins! Except for those 2 punchers whose faces and whose reputations were unknown, it would be much simpler to end it all with one swift shot. 90 yards now, with the first boulder in front of him. He could make it with a single shot. Miss Dick working more feverishly at those lashings when Sonnes' face was turned out towards the east. Afraid, was she? Alarmed at the persistent ogling of Bill Sonnes? At that slow, insinuating manner with which he was bridging the distance between them, almost imperceptibly, meaningly. 25 yards to the next boulder, a larger one where he could rest a little from this snake-like position of his limbs. A boulder which threw him still more behind Sonnes' back. Rangy crept forward again. This time, for the half of the distance, Sonnes' gaze was studying the east, and the girl's hands worked with steady insistence. He could see harder lines upon her face when she glanced down for an instant in a vain effort to discover what progress she had made. And for the balance of the distance, while Sonnes watched her insolently, Rangy could see the contempt in the girl's poise. Rangy reached the boulder and peered out eagerly. From this position it should be easier now. He was almost at Sonnes' back, even when the man turned towards the girl. But there was danger, he felt, in that instinctive sense of alarm which warns all animals, man and beast alike, a latent sense which might carry its message to Bill Sonnes. There was the possibility that Miss Dick might glance around in those moments when Sonnes' face was turned away, and that she might see him. Once or twice already she had turned her head, feverishly, hurriedly, in an effort to look at those lashed bonds, but she had not raised her eyes. Should she raise her eyes now as he crawled forward, he would be directly in her line of vision. What then? Again Rangy crawled forward. He must take his chance that Miss Dick would prefer him as a captor, rather than Sonnes. Steadily, with patient persistence, with sounds so slight that he scarcely heard his own movements, Rangy Pete crawled forward, from boulder to boulder, and still Sonnes continued to bask in the girl's presence. Still the backs of the well-trained punchers remained turned towards Sonnes and his quarry. and now that Rangy had drawn so close he could see that there was a gap of a good 10 yards between Sonnes and the others. 25 yards distant now. A shot in the back? No. In the past few minutes he had grown to hate Sonnes too much for that. He had grown to hate the man's reptilian manner, that nameless something which showed in his whole pose. A shot in the back would not be enough for Bill Sonnes. A steady look in the eye would be much better. A steady look which would warn Sonnes of the inevitable call of death. A look which would give to him at least one moment of terror of the future. To die suddenly would not be enough for the man whose manner could insinuate such things to a girl with hands lashed behind her back. He had earned, as well, a period of horror through which he must contemplate the surety of death. The thought of that left Rangy's fingers itching still more. Miss Dick turned her face aside, and there was hatred and some terror in her pose. He could see that now, just 20 yards away. He must look into Bill Sonnes' eyes first, before the battle came. And yet there were two punchers just 10 yards beyond Bill Sonnes. Rangy crawled forward with still greater caution. It would not be a sound now which would warn Sonnes. It would be a message of that hatred which was burning in his heart. 20 yards more. Miss Dick turned suddenly. The message of a presence had reached her. She glanced up, and her eyes met his. For the merest fraction of time it seemed that the girl's eyes were puzzled. Then a swift change swept over them, whose meaning Rangy could not read. She turned her face away just in time to meet Bill Sonnes' glance. She met the man's glance fairly, and for the first time since Rangy had watched her, Miss Dick made some faint response to Sonnes' advances. She leaned towards him just a little, and when the man stretched forward more eagerly than he had yet done, the movement threw his back still more towards Rangy Pete. In Rangy's heart there was a strange thrill of admiration for the girl's quick wit, mixed with a deeper conviction of hatred for the man Sonnes. If only the girl would continue to play the part she had suddenly chosen, he would still look death into the man's eyes. Rangy pulled his body forward with barely more sound than was made by the passing breath of air. Looking across the shoulder of the man Sonnes, he could see into the girl's face. She, in turn, was looking at Sonnes, and even as Rangy watched, he could see the suggestion of an encouraging smile creeping into her eyes. Playing her part admirably, cleverly, Sonnes reached out his arms, and still the smile lingered about Miss Dick's eyes. He must hurry now, if he were to save the girl from the disgrace of Bill Sonnes' arms. 10 yards now. 8. 5. He dare not risk more, for even as he pulled himself into a sitting posture, Sonnes' arms were closing about the girl. Beyond him, the two punchers still sat like statuettes, careless of the scene behind them. 3-1. A smile came to Rangy Pete's heart, though his lips were straight and firm as he lay 1 6-gun across the curve of his hip. Then he tapped lightly upon the rock with the knuckles of his left hand. Still Sonnes did not heed, the crudeness of his senses being wrapped up in a contemplation of what this sudden yielding of Miss Dick might mean to him. Rangy tapped more loudly. The faint sound carried through the short space, and it reached Sonnes' brain. His unclosed arms dropped swiftly from about the girl, his body jerked back a foot or two, and he shot one swift glance across his shoulder. As his eyes met the stern glance of Rangy Pete, they held there for a swift moment of astonishment. Then the astonishment vanished, and there came a quick realization of the position in which he found himself. 5 yards away was Rangy Pete, looking into his eyes that cold, unmistakable message, which meant the ending of all feuds, the ending of life, and of all things else, for one of the two. The end of all things for one of them, and Rangy Pete held over him that thin edge of advantage which may mean life or death when desperate men face each other across the cold muzzles of weapons. Yet only 10 yards away were two men. One word of warning, just the lifting of his voice, and those two men would be here, fighting at his side. But Bill Sonnes knew the futility of that one word of warning. Rangy Pete's eyes told him that. They told him that no matter what the world might hold for the rest of mankind, it held nothing for him but this short moment of terror through which he must contemplate the cold approach of death. Death, stealing upon him, looking into his face from the eyes of Rangy Pete. A cold, merciless death, just as cold and unscrupulous as he had felt a moment ago towards the girl at his side. She had been his prey. And now, God in heaven, but he knew the game of Rangy Pete. One word, the faintest sound of warning, and Rangy would shoot him down coldly. But he knew it was not for that word of warning that Rangy was waiting. It was for that instinctive jerk of Sonnes' fingers which would tell him that an enemy was reaching for his gun. There before him sat Rangy Pete, with the horror of a blank future in his eyes. His gun was not in sight, but Sonnes felt that it could not be far from that right hand which dangled so carelessly at his side. Rangy Pete was a fool, even to take his hand from his gun. That was not what he would have done. He would not have sat thus, torturing another with the surety of death. How his fingers itched to reach for his gun. How his tongue quivered to shriek out a warning. Yet either act meant death. God, death with a scurvy past tormenting him already with its memories. To move, to speak, if only he dared to take his gaze away from Rangy Pete's face. So that was Rangy's game. He knew it now. It was an old game which he himself had tried upon more than one of his victims. It was that old cruel game of badgering the other man until in desperation he drew for his weapon. In swift memory, the faces of men leaped before him, men whom he had tortured in just this same way. One of them had been a youth, a mere youth. He could see even now the whiteness which came to that youth's cheeks, the cold sweat of death which leaped to his forehead when first he came to realize Bill Sonnes' purpose. And now he, Sonnes, was staring that same death in the face, in just the same way. God, the torture of it, the horror. He did not want to die. Life just a moment ago had been too keenly athrill with promise. It had been whispering to him strange things, promising him a taste of those joys which he knew must be found somewhere upon the pages of the life of man. Death staring him in the face, the joy of stolen fruits, mean, sordid fruits, the joy of their promise. And now, death staring at him. If only he dared to reach for his gun, he might beat Rangy to the draw. If only he dared to shout aloud, he might distract Rangy's attention by the confusion of numbers. If only he had the courage to sit still and stare back at Rangy Pete. Suddenly some of the fear left Sonnes' face, and in its place came cunning. Why had he not thought of the way out before? "I'll surrender," he whispered in a thin voice which barely reached Rangy Pete. A look of disgust flashed over Rangy's features. He was conscious that in this moment the thin margin of advantage had slipped from him. Instinct told him that treachery lurked behind the mild tone of Bill Sonnes. But the code of the plains forbade violence towards a man who yields. "You poor idiot, what you wanta go and do that for?" he returned in a peevish whisper. "All right, hands up." Sonnes began to raise his hands slowly, cautiously, but some thread of sound or some message of Rangy's presence must have been carried to those watchers beyond, for abruptly one of them turned about and glanced curiously over his shoulder. He was a middle-aged man, with features seamed with the life of the plains. For a small fraction of time he stared, then a low exclamation escaped his lips. That sound reached Bill Sonnes. It reached Rangy Pete. It drew as well the gaze of a much younger man at his side, a mere youth. With a quick darting glance, Rangy's eyes left Sonnes. He knew the folly of that. He knew the trickery of Sonnes. He knew the fatality of events which were sweeping down upon him in swift crisis. Even as his eyes met those of the older man for an instant, even before they flashed away again, Rangy was conscious that Sonnes' right hand had begun that downward sweep which meant battle. Instantly Sonnes' voice cut sharply through the silence. "At him, boys. Fast! The flash of instinct rushed Rangy Pete into battle. Chance had swept all other choice from him. Sonnes' fingers were working now with their old swift skill, with the goad of fear in the brain which drove them on, and Rangy felt that he had lost that thin margin of advantage which had been his. There was but the one chance to do battle against three, and that was his sidelong fling with it shot from the ground. Even as Sonnes' gun whipped into sight, Rangy flung his body sideways to carry him farther from the girl, and as he sprawled at length upon the ground he fired across his hip. At the same instant Sonnes' gun barked, and he felt the whine of the bullet as it cut through the air at the place where his body had been but a second before. Sonnes fired just the once, then his body sagged sluggishly to one side, and past him, in the open space beyond, Rangy caught sight of the two punchers. The one, the youth, was staring in amazement. The other, the middle-aged man with the grim face, was drawing his gun. And so swift had been the passage of time that his fingers had not yet reached the butt protruding from the holster. Rangy fired again from the ground. The six-gun dropped clattering from the man's hand. "Put 'em up, kid," Rangy spoke crisply. "They's times when it's a heap better to start waving towards your future home on high than it is to go a clawin' fer a gun. And this is one of them times. That's better, kid. If you wasn't so young and tender, I might go to shooting you up a bit. But mabbe it ain't your fault that you been flockin' about with coyotes like Bill Sonnes. Now keep 'em there, kid, and you'll most mabbe live to tell the youngsters all about how you got held up once by a real bad man." As Rangy talked, he rose to his feet briskly, crossed over and took possession of all the visible weapons. "Got any guns hid out on me, gents?" he demanded, and the older man hurried an assurance that they were weaponless. "Then you ain't learned all you mighta learned from that coyote," Rangy declared. "Youse two gents just herd yoreselves together and don't get frisky while I attends to some other business." Rangy's other business happened to be a visit to Miss Dick. He stooped over without looking into her face and cut the lashings from her wrists. "You'll have to 'skuse me, Miss, for hornin' my way into this little party, but I kinda got the idea that them punchers wasn't being nice to you. If I made a mistake, all you gotta do is show me the door." "I think you had better stay and look after the men you shot," Miss Dick returned, with an attempt at calmness which did not entirely conceal her relief at the turn of events. "That person looks as though he was dead." Rangy crossed over to the tumbled heap which had once been Bill Sonnes, which had looked so daringly at the captive girl. He stooped over, put his hand inside Sonnes' shirt, then faced Miss Dick again. "They's only one guess, Miss," he spoke humbly, "and you've got it right. Now I'll be looking after this other gent what stepped in front of something hard." "Gosh A'mighty!" The exclamation was due to the action of the youthful puncher who was now running across the narrow strip of trail between them and the cayuses. Almost as Rangy looked, he leaped to the back of one of the animals and began to race towards that sharp rock marking the turn in the trail around which Rangy had so recently stalked them. Rangy stooped, picked up a Winchester from the pile of arms, and followed on foot. When he crossed that 100 yards and stood looking into the straight trail beyond, he saw that the youthful rider was a bare 100 yards ahead of him. Rangy raised the rifle, and through the sights he caught the clear outline of the flying figure. He saw as well that the youth turned and looked over his shoulder, and even at that distance he fancied he could read the wave of fright which suddenly swept over the other's features. With a sigh, Rangy Pete lowered the rifle and stood looking at the figure flying before him. Shortly there was a faint noise at his side, and when he swung about quickly he saw Miss Dick looking at him curiously. "You could have. Why didn't you?" she demanded in the tone of one who seeks for knowledge. "Never could hit anything on the move," Rangy evaded. "Was it because he was so young?" the girl insisted, ignoring the obvious evasion. "Let's go back and see if any more of them's got the running habit," he evaded for the second time. "I s'pose we'd soon better be on the move, because Merrill's army ain't so far behind." The girl followed beside him as he returned to the scene of recent battle, and there they found the middle-aged puncher sitting on the ground, trying to bandage his wounded wrist. "Needin' help, pard?" Rangy asked. Then he bent over and assisted the man to rearrange the bandages. When he completed the work, he again found Miss Dick's eyes upon him curiously. "As I been sayin', Miss, we'd better be slopin'." Rangy made haste to forestall any questioning. "Smithers, you stay here and keep a wake over Bill Sonnes. You'll 'skuse me, pard, if I take the liberty of taking your arsenal along with me. How soon can you be ready, Miss?" "Where are you taking me?" she asked quietly. "Back to Triple Butte as you said you would do?" "Shore, I ain't gonna break no promises. But first of all we gotta be moochin' it out of the way of Dan Merrill's army. He's a curious cuss, that Merrill. He mightn't understand why Bill Sonnes is a lyin' there all crumpled up, and why Smithers won't be good for anything for 2-3 months. He's impetuous like, and apt to be resentful. So, Miss, we'll be joggin' along, soon's you are ready." "I am ready now," the girl returned quietly. "Then if you wait till I get yeller boy, we'll be ridin' right along." Rangy spoke as he started out. The yellow cayuse was hidden beyond a bend in the trail, so it was quite possible, he appreciated, that when he returned Miss Dick might once more be making a natural move in search for freedom. He had played fair with her, he had told her of his unaltered purpose, he had given her a chance to escape. Yet when again he caught a glimpse of the recent scene of struggle, he knew that Miss Dick had not taken advantage of his absence. By the time he reached camp, she was mounted upon her cayuse and was waiting, somewhat impatiently, to make a start. "We'll be following the little boy cowpuncher to see that he don't get into no danger," Rangy tried to speak lightly, though he was conscious of a strain. "Look after things, Smithers, till we get back." Side by side they rounded the sharp rock in the trail which led onward to the pass, and the moment they were beyond sight of the back trail, Miss Dick asked, "You say there is a Merrill army behind us?" "They shore is, a big one. Must be most nigh 50 riders. Not more'n 2 hours back of us." Rangy found himself interrupted by a low ripple of laughter without merriment. "What's troublin' you, girl?" "Nothing, except that there is a Merrill army in front of us as well. That is where that boy rider has gone." "Gosh A'mighty!" Rangy exclaimed. "You sure of that?" Miss Dick nodded, and in the quick jerk of her head Rangy recognized a sudden consciousness of power. "How far in front of us?" he asked slowly, aware that in the mere asking he lost some of his pose of self-reliance. "Which way are they riding?" 4 or 5 miles. "It isn't more than that to the pass," Miss Dick returned, and the strange lights in her eyes had abruptly become an acknowledgment of Rangy's dependence upon her knowledge. "I expect they're hiding somewhere around the pass if they haven't found out already that the Dervishers all got through last night. If they've found that out, that boy cowpuncher will probably meet some of them coming back." Miss Dick paused abruptly, and the sidelong glance of her eyes, the queer little twist to her lips, were a challenge to his boast of efficiency. For a brief space she watched him, and as Rangy Pete did not take up the unfinished sentence, she put that challenge into words. "They have us trapped on both sides. How are you going to get us out, Mr. Rangy Pete?" There was the barest suggestion of lingering over the word us. Yet that, he felt quite sure, was nothing but mockery. But there was an appealing something in her manner of which he could not be quite so certain. Still, he could not answer the girl's question, for she had stated obvious truths. He knew there was an army behind. She said there was an army in front. The only other way of escape was over the face of the buttes, and in his brief climb of some minutes ago he had learned the futility of attempting to escape over the top of the world. That in the end must mean death, slow death from thirst and starvation. If it were possible to take cayuses along, there might be a hope. But to climb those buttes alone, to face the cold of the nights, the blistering heat of the days, to stumble on and on, knowing not the way, waiting only for death. Rangy Pete shook his head suddenly. "Then tell me why you rescued me from that horrible puncher you called Sonnes," Miss Dick spoke more crisply. For the barest fraction of a minute, as Rangy's gaze wandered over the features of the girl before him, as he noticed again the shimmer of her hair, the firm full lines of her features, as he studied for an instant the deep blue of her eyes, there flashed into his mind a thought which in the past few hours had not been a stranger to him. That Miss Dick, under other conditions, must really be one of the greatest prizes which Earth could give to man. He knew that for an instant that thought softened the lines of his features which he had hoped to keep firm. So he answered quickly, lightly, "You shore didn't think I'd let Bill Sonnes take you back to Triple Butte when I'd promised to take you? That is the only reason? So you could keep that foolish promise of yours?" "Certain," Rangy nodded deliberately. "You lie. Now how are you going to get me out of this?" Miss Dick spoke impatiently, but for some strange reason which Rangy did not stop to analyze, her abrupt violence of tongue brought to him a memory of that old thrill which had once warmed the blood of him in her presence. She knew that there had been something personal in that rescue, that he was not merely the machine. Gad, but he was merely a machine, trying to teach to her. "I asked you how you are going to get me out of this," the voice insisted at his side. "Seeing that I'm dead certain they's a big enough army behind us to gobble us up, we'll be movin' on ahead. Come along." Miss Dick responded with alacrity. She urged her cayuse forward, and a minute later they were cantering briskly along the butte land draw. Unconsciously, as though born to the ranks of those who rule, the girl took the lead. Rangy was content that she should do so, for that permitted him to watch the shimmer of her hair, the quick little fling of her shoulders, the arrogant poise of her head, the litheness of her figure, and the 101 other things about her which made up that attractiveness of which before he had been but vaguely conscious. Now he was more than conscious of it. There was an intensity to that consciousness which brought a feeling of constriction about his heart, a slight burning in his veins, a racing in his blood, which made him suddenly glad that Bill Sonnes' arms had not closed about her. There was a smothering sensation in his breast, which left a slight haze in his brain. But that would be the result of his persistent efforts through 2 days and a night. Surely bodily weakness was not seizing him now, at the moment when most he needed strength. Still, that tightening of the chest, that smothering feeling, did not leave him. If anything, it grew more acute when he caught the strange, challenging lights in Miss Dick's eyes as she glanced at him from time to time over her shoulder. There was something queer in the girl's eyes. Could it be possible that she too was breaking down under the strain of their long activity? Queer that he had not thought of that before, for her activity had been as prolonged as his. Strange lights in Miss Dick's eyes. Smiling even, to herself. Yes, they were both breaking down under the strain. Beautiful even, when the slanting rays of the sun played upon her in this manner. Yes, he was glad now that he had shot Bill Sonnes. That had been an evil leer upon Sonnes' lips. That had been an evil thought which stretched out the man's arms in embrace. How Rangy's blood raced warmly as he thought of that. Of course it would be mountain fever which had taken a grip of him. Was it that fever which made him fancy that the girl's eyes were shining when she looked back at him? Or was it the way the gleam of the sun rays caught them? How bronzed were the girl's arms, how perfectly she sat the saddle. That did not speak of weariness. "Have you quite decided where you are going to take me?" Miss Dick's voice brought him back to an abrupt consciousness that there was a problem before him. Strange, but for a moment he had quite forgotten it. "We will have to take a chance that no one catches us before dark. Surely we'll be able to slip by them in the night." "It will be moonlight," the girl called back as she urged her cayuse forward. It would be moonlight, with the shimmering moonlight of the butte lands which would search out every nook and cranny, which would close every avenue of escape unless chance should play a part. Rangy was beginning to appreciate his helplessness in the face of circumstances, when the girl spoke again. "Besides, they will be after you long before dark. At the most you have the time it will take a man to ride 4 miles and back again." Rangy did not answer. Escape for a man alone might be possible. He shook his head doggedly, almost angrily, at the dun walls of the buttes which stood up cold and impassive, careless of the problems of man, indifferent to his future, but holding him nevertheless to this narrow pathway along which the punchers must shortly ride. "Have you anything to suggest?" the girl demanded, with another backward glance over her shoulder. The girl's eyes were sparkling. Almost he fancied there was delight in their depths. delight in his inefficiency in this emergency. "I got a couple of 6 guns and a Winchester," he returned. "Silly," the girl laughed. "Is that all? It's good for a half dozen of them Merrill riders. Don't boast, for they would bury you before morning if they bothered to bury you at all. Is that all?" "Somethin's bound to turn up," Rangy replied, though conscious of the girl's increasing delight. "Then you admit you are stumped?" Miss Dick insisted. "Yet if I were alone, the matter for me would be simple." Rangy jerked the burnt yellow cayuse to a sliding stop. "They ain't nothin' like considerin' yoreself alone, Miss. If you know a way to get outa this mess, I'll shore be turnin' my back." Miss Dick's cayuse stopped some 10 paces beyond him. "I wasn't saying that I wanted to be alone," she laughed softly. "I was just hinting that sometimes when a man falls down, perhaps a woman could find the way through." "Well?" Rangy questioned, and he began to wonder if it would be objectionable after all to be dependent upon this girl whose soul had been nurtured by the iron of the buttes, but whose eyes were now dazzling with the lights of merriment. "I owe you a debt. Perhaps I can cancel it. You saved me from Sonnes. If I save you from the wrath of Sonnes' friends, the debt will be cancelled, perhaps." "That debt? You ask no more?" "More? What more is there that I could ask?" The wonderment in the girl's manner was confusing to Rangy's self-esteem. There was this manner in which he was dogging her steps. There was his promise to teach to her the code of mankind, and yet she had not asked that he forego them. "What more could I ask?" the girl pressed. "I kinda thought mabbe you might want me to lay off taking you back to Triple Butte." "Oh," the girl exclaimed softly, "but I could not ask that. It has been too amusing. You agree to the other? There is but little time to lose." Rangy Pete nodded, for the abrupt shock of his vanity did not encourage speech. A moment later they were galloping side by side along the draw, and this time Rangy Pete, though still conscious of the girl's charms, fought off the sentiment of her presence. For he, the self-reliant Rangy Pete, had become dependent upon a mere girl, perhaps even for his whole future. He tried to turn his eyes away, but found that they strayed constantly towards her. He tried to focus his mind upon the peril of the future, but that only drew him back to wonder about this plan which lay in the girl's brain. He tried to drive her from his thoughts, and in attempting that, he but found himself caught more hopelessly in a wild tangle of thought, of which Miss Dick was the background. He noticed now how confident she had become, how masterful, and yet back of that there was still that gleam of amusement in her eyes whenever she looked towards him. There was amusement, an impersonal thing, as though life were at last holding out some of the fruits of reward. How long he rode thus, studying the girl at his side, wondering at the quick, flashing moods which controlled her, Rangy Pete could not say. He knew only that she swept him back to the present with a quick gesture. "I told you there wasn't much time to spare," she exclaimed, with a little touch of excitement in her voice, as she pointed to a ridge in the butte land trail before them. There, through a gap in the buttes, was a clear vision of the trail beyond. It stood out clear cut before him, perhaps a mile distant, perhaps a half mile. But more important than the distance was the fact that a string of riders were racing down towards them. Miss Dick rode on, with Rangy at her side, and in a minute more the vision of the distant trail was lost to view. "The boy puncher didn't lose much time," the girl exclaimed. "He must have found the Merrill gang riding this way. Can you get a little more speed out of that cayuse, Mr. Pete?" Rangy Pete did. He used the spur on the burnt yellow cayuse, keeping at Miss Dick's side only with an effort, and wondering all the time at the meaning of this strange ride into the arms of the enemy. He had seen the enemy through the gap in the buttes, and this pace must bring them together. And what then? It was a strange rescue which Miss Dick was conducting, and yet, except for a slight heightening of the color in her cheeks, there was nothing about the girl's manner to indicate that she had anything at stake. For an instant there flashed into his mind a suspicion of trickery. Perhaps these would not be the Merrill riders after all. Perhaps they were Dervishers, and if they were? With an effort he forced that suspicion aside. He studied the girl's manner once more, and he could be certain now that the dappling of red which painted the bronze of her cheeks was born of elation. Once she glanced across her shoulder into his eyes, and the message which lay there was one of comradeship. For the meantime, all other moods had been swept away. This was a race which they two were running out together. It was a thrill of body which responded to the spirit of youth, and in the outward token of that thrill which lay in the girl's eyes there was a surety that behind it all was no trickery. There was comradeship for this moment, the closeness of comradeship which shares dangers alike. There was the spirit of youth which had risen up again to hold her in its grasp, which had painted into her cheeks and her eyes the sparkle of life, which had... "I knew we'd make it," Miss Dick exclaimed abruptly. "Make what?" Rangy asked, as he loosened the Winchester at his side, for he could see that unless something happened speedily, all they would make would be a clash with the enemy. "The Pelican Cave, of course," Miss Dick replied. "See it, off there?" The direction indicated was to the left, and it seemed to Rangy Pete that the girl was pointing up a draw which branched off this main trail, but which so far as he could see offered no outlet. Still Miss Dick turned her cayuse directly towards it, and as she did so, from the distance to the right there came the distant clatter of horses' shod feet striking the bare rock. Miss Dick looked anxiously over her shoulder, but the Merrill punchers were not yet to be seen. In front of him, as Rangy Pete rode, was this offshoot draw from the main trail. Even at close range it looked like a ragged tapering cone cut out of the face of the buttes, but where it should have wound its way on and on through the tangled ways of butte land, it ended instead in a sharp wall of rock. It began like an ordinary butte land valley winding its way through the jumble of buttes, and it ended a quarter of a mile farther on in a dun, placid face of rock. From the distance, that wall of rock looked like a sheer one, impossible for man to climb in this haste which was now upon them. Yet towards the left, perhaps halfway from the ground to the top of the cliff, there was a black spot which seemed but a smear upon the gray face of the rock. It was towards that black spot that the girl was riding, sitting sideways in her saddle and searching with her eyes the trail to the right, from which direction came the clatter of horses' hoofs. And now she had begun to talk, quickly, in jerky little imperative sentences, sentences which robbed Rangy Pete of all thought of command. "Must make it fast. Half-mile behind at the most. Passing Echo Rock. A stiff climb, but we'll make it if you do what I say. When I dismount, you work fast. Throw off saddle and bridle. Turn cayuse loose. Take all food from your saddlebags and put it in mine. Get your rope ready now. Here's one from my saddle. Tie the ends together. When we get there, fasten one end around my saddle, the other to your belt. I'll climb first because I know the way. Drag the saddle up after us by the rope." Miss Dick stopped as abruptly as she began, and Rangy found himself wondering at the quick command of her. It was almost as though she had enacted this scene many times before. There was about her as well a confidence which told Rangy that it had not even occurred to her that his views might not fit in with her plans. He looked at the face of the cliff, grown closer now and rising stark above them, and he wondered why that heavy saddle must be dragged up to that black hole which surely must be the mouth of the Pelican Cave. Still, in spite of that, he found that he was tying the ends of the ropes together just as Miss Dick had told him to. Abruptly, Miss Dick leaped from her cayuse and began to work at the saddle and bridle with swift, sure hands. While working at his own, Rangy found that there was a calm haste about the girl, a swift deliberation which a tangled end of his emotions wanted to admire, even while the bulk of his thought was with the peril of the situation which faced them. Rangy Pete worked with mechanical swiftness, and shortly he found himself stooping over for Miss Dick's saddle. A remarkably heavy thing after all, for all its appearance of lightness. Those saddlebags must be tightly packed. Now he was at the foot of the cliff, and the girl was already climbing. "Bring the saddle up a few feet. There is a ledge here to rest it on." The distance to that black spot on the gray face of the cliff was not so great after all. Rangy could see now that it would be 50 feet, a trifle more at the most. Except for one or two narrow ledges, the climb was a sheer one, But it was an ancient way, known to the footsteps of some long lost generation, for carefully chiseled out of the face of the rock were steps like the rungs of a ladder. It would be the cave of some tribe of man long passed from the face of the earth, a den towards which he and Miss Dick were climbing. A trap, as well. Rangy stopped in his climbing. "When they get us here, how long will it take them to starve us out?" he demanded suddenly. "Is there any food or water up there?" "There is not." "Then there's nothing to be gained by starvin' in a cave, Miss. I'd better be stayin' down below. I'll fight 'em off till after dark, and then mabbe you can slip down and mooch it outa the way." "Come, Mr. Pete, please hurry. They are almost here. I can hear the horses again." "No, Miss, they ain't no use for me to get up into that cave. I've hadda think fast, and the way I see it, we can't take no chances of lettin' them camp around the bottom of this cliff. They'd shore have us corralled tighter'n a drum. But if I stay at the bottom, behind one of them rocks, and kinda discourage them from nosin' up here too close, while you salutes them from above, we got a chance. We might slip out after dark." Behind him came the sudden clatter of galloping horses, as the foremost riders rounded the point of rock from the main trail several hundred yards away. "I'd better slope it back quick," Rangy declared, as he made a downward step. "No, no!" Miss Dick exclaimed, with a trace of excitement in her manner. "This is not a cave. I hadn't intended to tell you, but it is the way through the buttes. Come, hurry. They will be shooting soon." Rangy liked that excitement in the girl's tones. There was a personal note in it which brought back the old thrill. There was as well a suggestion of concern which he was too human to overlook. "That's different. I'm with you, long's we ain't a hornin' our way into no corral what we can't find our way out of. You just run along fast. I'll be right after you." That new thrill was still running warm in the veins of Rangy Pete as they climbed the face of the cliff. In his brain was a consciousness that Miss Dick did not want to leave him to the mercies of the riders from the Snaky Y. But this was no time to look about for her motives. In his ears was the sound of galloping horses. Rangy did not look around, for he dreaded the moment when those sounds must cease. Miss Dick climbed briskly. Now she was at the very edge of the cave. A few more steps and he would be at her side. Abruptly the clatter of horses' hoofs died away. Rangy Pete knew the meaning of that. "Hurry!" he exclaimed. "They'll be shooting now." Almost as he spoke there came the whine of a bullet and a dull shattering sound as it bit its way into the face of the cliff, then fell back lifeless. Miss Dick threw herself over the edge of the cave. Just 2 steps more to make himself and he would be at her side. Behind him there was the sharp snapping of pistol shots. At his side was the deadened thud of bullets. Now he was at the edge of the cave. The girl's arm was thrust out to pull him more swiftly into safety. More bullets whining their way past his head or biting ineptly at the cold face of the rock. He was at the edge now, tumbling into safety. He had beaten them. Beaten them? What was that hot, searing sensation which cut its way through his right leg and left it all but powerless? What was that dizzying reel in his brain? Miss Dick at his side, tugging now at that rope which he had fastened about his waist. Strange, but he had forgotten that. There was a saddle at the far end of that rope, a remarkably heavy saddle which Miss Dick, through some foolish mood, was trying to rescue from the Snaky Y punchers. Rangy put his hand to the rope and tugged with Miss Dick, still firing outside, doubtless trying to cut the rope with their bullets. Through an endless period that firing continued, while he labored beside the girl. In time, many hours later it seemed, the sound of angry bullets died away and the drab old saddle crawled through the mouth of the cave and lay there before him. "Foolish old thing," Rangy muttered, conscious that he was caught in the grip of some unusual circumstance. Miss Dick swung towards him quickly. "You're hurt?" she exclaimed instantly, and again Rangy was aware of that personal note. It was such a pleasing thing, that personal note in the girl's voice. It was pleasing as well to see that sudden flash of alarm which leaped into her eyes. Alarm for him. Queer old world. How topsy-turvy things had become. Miss Dick, the bandit, feeling alarm for him. "Just a scratch. Ain't nothin'," Rangy declared. though quite conscious that he did not want that alarm to die out of the girl's features. "Nothin' atoll," he insisted, and to prove that fact he tried to rise to his feet. He reached that position in a tottering way, only to tumble back to the floor of the cave when he put his foot to the ground. He tumbled to the floor of the cave. He knew that perfectly well. It was quite natural that he should do so, but the rest of it was all strange. It was not natural that the floor of the cave should open up before him, and that he should keep on tumbling and tumbling, on and on, falling through endless space, through rocks and trees and clouds, through alternate light and darkness, through new and old scenes. Yes, it was most natural after all. A moment ago he had not known himself. Now it was quite all right. He knew himself. He remembered it all distinctly. He was Dan Merrill, and he had just been killed by Bill Sonnes when they fought over Shifty Liz back in Tony Burke's saloon. Darkness. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of Rangy Pete by Guy Morton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. When the darkness gradually gave way to rifts of light here and there, Rangy Pete was conscious of an occasional snapping, whining sound which touched some vague spot in his memory. There would come a dreary, whining slur which he knew quite well, followed by a rattling, shattering succession of noises quite unfamiliar to his senses. From time to time, near at hand, there was a sharp stabbing of the air, which reached his eardrums with unnecessary violence. And always, it seemed to him, that was followed by the whining and shattering of other sounds. Once, when that volume of unfamiliar noise grew intense, Rangy Pete opened his eyes wearily. The scene was familiar enough, but that sound did not belong to him at all. The scene was the edge of the earth. It was that black cave from which he had tumbled into eternity when Bill Sonnes shot him back there in Burke's saloon. That was quite right, but this slithering noise, like some giant hammer chopping at blocks of stone, it was annoying. It ruffled the peacefulness of eternity. Queer, but there seemed to be a physical side to him now. There was now a dragging something cluttering all about that lightness of soul which through unlimited years had been wandering through infinite spaces. There was a restraining something hedged all about that mentality which but a moment ago had known neither bounds nor limits. There was... Rangy Pete opened his eyes again. There was a searing in his right leg, just above the knee. Gad, there was a girl right in front of him. She had a Winchester in her hands, and she was firing from time to time out the mouth of the cave. And that shattering volume of noise was made by the occasional bullet which whipped upward from the ground, bit into the roof of the cave, and loosened fragments of rock all about them. There was the echo of the Winchester as the reverberations of sound traveled the length of the cave like the rumblings of distant thunder and then died away. There was the acrid smell of burnt powder upon the air. There was a bandage about his leg which had stopped the flow of blood. Rangy Pete rose to his elbow, and as he did so, Miss Dick swung about to face him. There was a brilliance in her eyes, a glow upon her cheeks, which he had never seen before. There was a keenness of battle in her pose, which in some unexplained manner recalled to him the poise of a mother wolf he had once seen fighting for her young. "Looks as though they pinked me," Rangy muttered. "What's going on now?" "Nothing. We're just exchanging friendly salutes. I am letting the Merrill gang know it wouldn't be wise to try to climb up that stairway. How are you feeling, Mr. Pete?" "Like a branded maverick, I'm thinking. But why haven't you sloped it long ago?" "They would have had you strung up by this time," the girl replied calmly. "I had to stay, Mr. Pete, because I knew the curiosity of that bunch of riders. One of them just climbed up the stairs. I nicked him a little. That is what the firing has been about. It has stopped now." The sound of firing had died away, and through the calm which settled down upon them, Rangy felt that he could think more clearly. He found that his head had been pillowed upon Miss Dick's saddle, so he let it fall back again, and he lay there contemplating the girl and the scene about him. This cave was pleasantly, restfully robed in the soft shades of twilight, though from the color of the air beyond, he knew it must still be daylight in the world outside. The sun, he could remember, had been slanting down behind the butte tops when he and Miss Dick made that dash for the Pelican Cave way back in the distant ages when some other race of mankind lived upon the earth, and still there was daylight outside. This must mean that, after all, he had not been traveling for years and generations through those mystic and darkened realms which held him for a time, but that in reality it could have been but a few minutes. Yet in those few minutes Miss Dick had been active. She had bound up his wound, which felt hot and restless now. She had pillowed his head upon her saddle. She had found stones in some strange manner with which to build a barricade between them and the mouth of the cave, and she had fought off the punchers. Rangy Pete looked about him, at the barricade, at the clear, day-lit air beyond. "So you nicked one of the punchers?" he asked meditatively. "Just a little, through the arm. He would insist upon coming up here even after I had fired a couple of shots into the air. That squares accounts for you." There were facts which Rangy must get firmly fixed in his mind, facts which somehow had become warped and distorted through that age he had spent in another world. "And didn't you say something about this not being a cave, but that it runs through the buttes to the land of the Dervishers?" Miss Dick nodded. There could be no doubt of it now. Miss Dick had saved his life, and the price she had paid had been her own opportunity to escape. "You know your way through the cave?" Rangy pressed, caught in the abrupt knowledge that he must be quite clear upon that point. Miss Dick laughed easily. "Know the way? I have known it since a child. Day or night I know it. It leads off here into the dark, and from the dark, Mr. Rangy Pete, if you take the right steps and the right turns, you come out into the light on the top of the buttes. And then if you take the right steps again, you come down into the land of the Dervishers, as you call it, though we call it home." Was it wistfulness or humor in the girl's voice? There was still a sparkle in her eyes, he knew, but that had come from battle. "And no one knows where this queer path leads down into your home?" Rangy asked. "I mean, no one but Dervishers?" "No one but Dervishers." "Then, girl, you had better be going before the punchers come again." Miss Dick looked at him strangely, so strangely that Rangy stumbled over his words. "They'll be coming again. Mustn't let them brand you with a bullet. I'll hold them off for a while. I'm thinking I could keep them busy a whole night." Rangy Pete broke off, for there was something in the girl's silence which told him that his words were all foolishness. She turned her eyes away swiftly, and she began to busy herself with the weapons which lay at her side. Rangy lay still and watched her for some minutes, and as he watched, he listened for sounds from the punchers down below. Miss Dick's activity, he discovered, was spurious, for though her fingers were busy, she was doing nothing. From beyond the mouth of the cave there came an occasional sound which betrayed to him the temper of the punchers. There was silence, broken at times by the angry whip of a bullet as it cut through the mouth of the cave and bit into the rocky roof beyond them. There drifted up to him an odor of campfire smoke, quite different from this acrid smell of powder, and that spoke of camps for the night. Through the mouth of the cave, the crystal of the air was thinning. Dark shadows were showing on the buttes beyond. The twilight of this cave was growing denser. Night was coming upon them, and the punchers were camping in the draw below, determined to catch them, no doubt, believing they were trapped in this hole in the wall of the cave, knowing or thinking, they knew, that it would be only a matter of time until starvation forced them to yield. If only there were not that searing burn in his leg, he would laugh at them now. But there was that crumpled leg, and there was also Miss Dick before him, toying with a 6-gun, cleaning it again and again. He, at least, was trapped. But why must this girl suffer with him? Yet he dreaded that strange look which came into her eyes when he spoke to her of escape. Rangy's left hand strayed up to toy with the tip of his left ear. He cleared his throat, and he began resolutely. "Now, Miss Dick, I'm gonna throw the rope straight this time, and tell you they just ain't no use of the both of us being caught by them wild men punchers down below.
The girl bandit turned her face towards him again, and though the deepening of twilight threw her features into shadow, he could still see the sparkle of her eyes. "Shore, Mr. Pete," she returned, mimicking his voice, "but you don't go far enough. I don't see any use of either of us being caught." "You don't? With a dozen punchers down below, and a whole army of most nigh 50 on the way?" Miss Dick shook her head firmly. "What difference does it make how many there are? Only one man can climb those steps at a time." Rangy was almost startled at the calm deliberation of her voice and manner. There was about her now some of the cool fighting instinct which he knew to be a characteristic of the born gunman. But with Miss Dick it was different. She was cornered, while they had fought for the pure love of it. "That's what I'm sayin'," Rangy returned slowly. "I could fight them off all night and tomorrer, and while I'm doin' that, you could be lookin' up a more healthy climate. I'd shore like to go with you, but seein' as one of them punchers had to go and brand me on the leg "The bone isn't broken. You'll be able to crawl along in less than a week," Miss Dick interrupted swiftly, almost with violence in her manner. Rangy Pete leaned forward to study this queer, half shrinking, half arrogant mood which held the girl in its grip. But Miss Dick turned her face away, and the growing shadows of twilight told him nothing. "That sounds good," Rangy reflected, "but you shore don't think I could stand them off for a week." "No, but the two of us could." Rangy laughed uneasily. "I couldn't possibly let you take a chance like that. We'd be starved out, or you might get hit yourself." This time Miss Dick leaned over him quickly, and even through the shadows he could see the flash of her eyes. "If I were you, if I were lying as you are now, would you desert me, Rangy Pete?" the girl demanded. And now he knew there was real anger in her manner, anger because of his inference that she should not play the game to the end. "Tell me that, and I will know whether to go or to stay." "Shore, I'd leave you," Rangy replied calmly. "Every maverick for himself when they's a stampede on." "You lie, Rangy Pete. I am going to stay. We will fight them off until you are well enough to get away through the cave." Rangy Pete nodded, with the old thrill coursing its way through his veins. He had known long ago that Miss Dick was one of the prizes of earth. He knew now that she would be a comrade whom man could never forget. He thrilled in her presence. If only he could know the motive which urged her on. "You shore got the markin's of a thoroughbred," he reflected in admiration. "They ain't no reason why you shouldn't stay a while, and if it gets too hot at any time you can always make your escape." "Can't you see there isn't going to be much fighting?" Miss Dick replied more calmly. "They think we are trapped. They are not going to risk men up those steps. No, they will sit down to starve us out. They can't do that in a week. There is a lot of food in my saddlebags, and if it gets too bad I can slip out the back door at night. No, Mr. Rangy Pete, all we have to do is sit down quietly for a few days until your leg gets so you can crawl with it." "P'raps you're right," Rangy conceded. "Perhaps? Of course I'm right," the girl declared briskly, as she rose to her feet and disappeared in the darkened recesses of the cave. Rangy Pete felt a feverish restlessness stealing over him. There was the pain of his wound which throbbed its way through his veins, but greater than that, there was the uncertainty of the future which Miss Dick had chosen for herself. He wondered if the girl really knew what the immediate future must mean to her. Did she know that the whole burden of battle would fall upon her, or did that strange light in her eyes mean that she welcomed battle? There was that fever creeping into his blood. Doubtless in a few hours he would be delirious. Then there would be hours, days perhaps, through which he would be helpless. And through those days and hours, what would Miss Dick be doing? Fighting against thirst, starvation, and an army of reckless punchers. Fighting for him. Could she possibly know the horror of those days which were before her now? Could she know the torment of days and nights when the body must keep on toiling, and when the eyes dare not close in sleep? Rangy's eyes stole into the darkness of the cave, and there he saw the dim outline of the girl's figure moving about. Presently she came back with a fragment of rock in her arms, and she placed this on top of the barricade which she had built during his first trip into realms beyond the earth. For a time, with that fever creeping higher and higher in his blood, he watched the girl passing back and forth, toiling with the rock which made the barricade more and more effective. Shortly he discovered that she was doing this to shelter his position from stray bullets, but that knowledge only added to the flush of the fever which was burning its way through his body. Instead of asking him to move, she was building a barricade of rock between him and all possible harm. She left an opening in the wall. She spread a blanket beside that opening and placed a loaded Winchester and 6-gun upon the blanket. Then she carefully stored the food somewhere in the darkness beyond. After that, Miss Dick came and sat down upon the blanket, some 6 feet from where Rangy Pete lay. It was dark in the cave now. It was dark as well in the air beyond. Either that or his brain was already playing strange tricks upon him. "Good Lord, Miss," Rangy spoke suddenly from the depths of his heart. "You can't know what the next few days will mean. Better go now. You'll have a terrible time if you stay." The girl leaned forward and passed her hand lightly over his forehead. "Fever already," she muttered. "Take a drink, Mr. Rangy, and go to sleep if you can. You will feel better in the morning." With a strange desire to be obedient, he drank what the girl put to his lips. A moment later he was caught in a mixed wave of humiliation and gratitude. She had given him water from her own canteen, and he had taken it before he thought. Rangy leaned back against the saddle, cushioned with a blanket, and he tried to study the face of the girl at his side. That was impossible because of the film of darkness, but there was no reason why his brain, feverish as it was, could not picture Miss Dick's face after she had passed through days of thirst and starvation. And she would do that for him. She must know something of the horror of the immediate future, and yet she was sitting there calmly, staring out into the night. She would be watching the mouth of the cave, watching that spot where a man's head must show up against the blot of night, if any man had the courage. Rangy could not see the lip of the cave. He was almost glad of that. But he could see the sky beyond. He knew it must be sky because it was a dark gray patch thrown out against the surrounding world of darkness. For hours and hours, it seemed to Rangy Pete, he watched that gray patch of sky, and as he watched, it gradually grew lighter with a silvery sheen. That would be his imagination, or the fever. No, it was the coming of moonlight. Moonlight? Was it last night, or had it been a myriad years ago that he rode along a strip of moonlight with a girl at his side? Moonlight! For hours and hours it danced and glittered out there in the radiant air beyond the lip of the cave. Or was it minutes only? The girl barely moved, except to glance from time to time in his direction. He could tell that by the fling of her head. Silence in the world beyond, except for a snatch of campfire song which floated up through the moonlit air. Laughter, at times the sound of bickering voices. Rangy Pete knew that scene so well, just as well as though he had been seated at the side of the fire, flipping the cards or sharing in the banter. He knew there was no hope that the camp would melt away and that he and Miss Dick would be left to their own resources. Miss Dick, watching steadily that one point at the lip of the cave where a man's head must appear, sooner or later. It was inevitable that in any gang of a dozen punchers there must be at least one who would have the folly to climb that flight of stairs notched into the face of the rock. There would be at least one man who through the night would dare to peer over the mouth of the cave. And the girl sitting there so calmly, with weapons at her hands, waiting for the inevitable. She must know what he, Rangy Pete, knew, that there was more to be feared from folly than from actual attack. For what half score of punchers can sit about a campfire at night, with their quarry in sight, without being touched in some manner by the spirit of folly? Miss Dick must know that, for she was waiting, sheltered behind the barricade, but in such position that her presence must be stern discipline for folly.
Even through the fever which was burning into his system, Rangy felt like shuddering. Would the girl play the cold game of discipline, or would she barter with the enemy? Would she calmly shoot the first head which showed above the lip of the cave, or... Moonlight? Of course, that was moonlight, and it was through moonlight he had ridden some centuries ago, with this girl at his side. Moonlight in the air beyond, stealing now into the cave itself, glinting and shimmering back from the girl's head whenever she glanced about, glistening just as it had done last night when he rode that silent trail from the crags. Yes, it was last night that he had ridden with Miss Dick. It was last night he had ridden in arrogance, confident of the future, certain of his sway over her, certain that he was to take her back to Triple Butte to teach her. What was that he had thought to teach Miss Dick? Something about mankind. And here was she now, sitting there so calmly, with a 6-gun in her hand, waiting to shoot the first head which peered above that dangerous lip of the rock. Queer how topsy-turvy the world had become, and this fever in his blood, this pain in his right leg. The girl's cool hand now upon his forehead, a caressing, mothering touch there, something soothing. Or was that too but the antics of his imagination? But while the hand was there, he lost the desire to toss about. His brain became clearer, and he could see now beyond doubt that it was moonlight which was glinting back from Miss Dick's hair. It was moonlight, too, which showed him the soft lines about the girl's features, lines softer and more pitying than any he had seen there before. And was there as well something longing in the girl's eyes as she leaned above him, her hand still upon his forehead? Was there a soft lingering caress in her voice as she whispered a soothing childlike song? Why should he feel suddenly happy in spite of the fever and the pain? Perhaps that, as well, was but a trick of the fever. Perhaps. Yet that could hardly be, for now that the girl leaned back into her old pose of watchfulness, he could see clearly the lines of her features as the moonlight filtered into the mouth of the cave. There was something stern yet soft and mothering in the girl's countenance, the croon of a little song upon her lips. Strange that she should be sitting there so calmly, waiting to shoot a man, or many men if need be, and that there should be the soothing of faint song in the air. An unusual kind of girl, he must admit, which he should have recognized and admitted long ago. Quite too late now, and she was doing this for him. Moonlight, peering inquisitive moonlight, sifting its way into the cave until he could see the girl's features quite distinctly. Moonlight playing with its fantastic fingers over the scene beyond the mouth of the cave. It must be doing that, for the patch of sky which crossed his vision was clean, and the laughter reached him clearly through the rarefied atmosphere. He knew just what a wonderful night it must be out there in the Butteland moonlight. Wonderful, but not quite like the domestic peace of this other scene of which he was a part. Peace! That burning of fever had become almost a restful thing. Moonlight beyond, shattered suddenly by the bark of a 6-gun. Rangy waited for the sound of that annoying clatter of rock which must come when a bullet bit into the roof of the cave. The sound did not come. Poor shooting. That idiot down below had not even been able to hit the black spot which was the mouth of the cave. More shots. A quick barking fusillade of them. Somehow they seemed to come from a distance. The dying of laughter. The quick oaths of men. Another fusillade of shots. The whooping of healthy male voices. Silence down below, broken only by an anxious oath. A confusing situation. What could it mean? Foolish of him. Of course that would be the arrival of the army of punchers who had followed him all through the day and the night. Still more shots and angered voices. Miss Dick peering cautiously from the edge of the cave. "Come back, girl," Rangy called in a whisper. "They might shoot you." Miss Dick came back to his side. She put her hand once more upon his forehead and looked down upon him. Surely her eyes were shining with excitement.
"They are fighting out there, Rangy Pete," she spoke quietly. "What can that mean? Fighting? Out there?" he asked in a puzzled way. "Yes, the men who have just ridden in. The army which was behind us. They are fighting these Merrill punchers. What can it mean?" Rangy's answer was an inarticulate mumble of words. It was better to lie here thus, with the girl's cool hand upon his forehead, than to try to solve the foolish problems of cowpunchers. If they chose to fight, what did it matter to him? He preferred the peace of this silent cave. A ragged wrangle of shots down below, a quick burst of sound, the dominance of a man's voice, then silence. Silence except for the untraceable blur of sound which told of the presence of many men, but which in some ways seemed but a part of the silence of the night. What matter, 10 men or 1,000? Only one man could climb that stairway at a time. Only one man at a time could fall back to his death. Miss Dick, the efficient. He wondered now if she would be weary of the killing of men through the days before he dared to travel out through the back of the cave into the land of the Dervishers. He should not let her do that thing. It was wrong. But with this fever and this weakness upon him, what was there for him to do? Order Miss Dick to leave him? What good were orders to one who refused to obey? The code, the teaching of his code of mankind. Miss Dick's hand upon his brow, stroking the fever away with gentle fingers. Voices, annoying voices down below. Insistent voices, bellowing constantly. The girl leaned closer. "They are calling you by name, Rangy Pete," she whispered. "Do you not hear them?" "Shore I hear them. Idiots. Tell 'em to be still." "There's a man there who calls you his friend," the girl's voice continued to whisper. "He says everything is all right now. He calls himself Ike Collander. You know Ike Collander, Rangy?" "Shore. Li'l Ike of the 'Vaporated Apples. Gosh A'mighty!" Rangy rallied as though from fitful slumber. He partly pulled himself to one elbow, and he studied the scene about him with curious eyes. He listened for a moment to those voices down below. "I musta been a wanderin' in my head, Miss. I thought I heard somebody say somethin' about Ike Collander." "You did." From below came the long drawn out hail of an anxious voice. "What's the matter, Rangy? Whyn't you been answerin'?" "Ike!" Rangy exclaimed. "Ike Collander, shore enough." Then Rangy Pete raised his voice in welcome to Ike Collander. Immediately there came back a babel of sound. There was the clamor of mixed voices, and when the confusion died away, there came again the voice of Ike Collander. "I'm comin' up there, Rangy, so jest you go to holdin' yore hosses easy. Don't get no fightin' idea into yore head." The only sound which reached him now was the scraping of the man's shod feet as they groped and found those steps cut out of the face of the rock. "Pull me forward just a little," Rangy Pete whispered to the girl at his side. "Just enough so's I can see Ike the minute he sticks his head up." The girl obeyed without answering. Then instantly she sank back into the darkened portion of the cave behind the barricade. While those scraping sounds came from beyond the cave, Rangy reached out and put one hand upon the girl's arm. It was more restful thus. It brought for the time being a clarity of brain, when before his thoughts had been wandering. If by any chance his senses had been tricking him, the touch of the girl's arm would help him through. How restful to be able to lean thus upon another. Moonlight beyond, the faintest shimmer of it penetrating here and lighting up the gleam of the girl's eyes. Ike's groping fingers upon the lip of the cave. A head showing up against the clear background of sky. 6 feet distant. A man could sit here and kill until the weariness of killing. But no, he must hold close grip upon himself. "Hey there, you old tarnation idyot. Whyn't you been answerin' me afore?" Collander's voice was just on a level with the mouth of the cave. "But that shore is some castle you got there, Rangy." "Shore, li'l Ike. Ain't you got no manners? What you doin' a hangin' on my front doorstep? An' who's them noisy friends you got down below?" Ike Collander still clung to the mouth of the cave. They's a whole bunch of fellers what you know, Rangy. They's Jumbo Irish and Ring'em Foster, and but I'm comin' in to look around. You're a gonna stay right where you are, Mr. Ike, till I knows what you come for. You come to take me back to Triple Butte? You pore idiot. They shore must be somethin' wrong with you, Rangy. We come up the Pelican draw a chasin' dervishers, and we heard they's a bunch of Snaky Y punchers got you trapped here in a cave, so we moseyed right along. 'Tain't been no fun for them, Rangy, 'cause they's about a half dozen of them all nicked up and whining around. And now that you know you're with friends, can't I come in, Rangy? Shore, Ike. You won't find me good for much, but the faint flutter of Miss Dick's arm beneath the pressure of his hand caused the words to break upon Rangy's lips. Miss Dick the bandit was now entirely within his power. She was where he might teach to her that code of mankind. She was conscious of that. She must be. But beyond that first flutter of her arm, the girl gave no sign that she appreciated the full meaning of this swift turn of events. It would be so easy now to hand Miss Dick over to the army from Triple Butte, to the punchers from the Triangle O and the Double K. Rangy Pete's fingers traveled down the girl's arm until they met her hand. Ike Collander out there, just a few feet away, making a great clattering noise as he scrambled over the lip of the cave. Rangy carried the girl's fingers to his lips. "Goodbye, girl. Go quick. Ike'll be here in a minute." "Go?" she asked in astonishment. "Yes, go." Miss Dick rose to her feet and vanished into the darkness of the inner cave. "They shore got me all bunged up, Ike," Rangy greeted his old associate. "Nicked in the leg. You come just in time." Ike Collander became solicitous. He examined Rangy as best he could, then he pronounced his judgment. "We shore gotta get some things up here, Rangy. I'm thinkin' I'd better be sayin' something to them idiots down below." Collander returned to the lip of the cave. Immediately he engaged in animated conversation with the punchers at the foot of the cliff. Rangy Pete gathered that Collander was issuing many instructions, and was arguing over them all. In some way or other those instructions had to do with caring for him here in Pelican Cave, but Rangy did not listen closely. It was all wearying detail. Besides, he missed the coolness of that hand which had rested upon his forehead. The fever, he knew, was coming back again. Yes, the fever was coming back, or why would he have fancied that Miss Dick was again at his side, that she was looking down upon him with widely curious eyes? That fever must be very bad indeed, or why would he have believed that he heard her voice? "Rangy, you sure are a trump card." It was just a whisper, a mere thread of a voice. Still, he was quite sure that it existed. He opened his eyes more widely. Yes, the girl was actually before him. "Then you are not going to take me back to Triple Butte after all, to teach me the code of man?" The lips were smiling, and the girl's eyes were dazzling. "No, little girl," Rangy whispered back through his weariness. "They ain't nothin' I wouldn't do to have you with me all the time. So that's why I gotta let you go." "Poor mixed up Rangy," the girl replied. "We must hurry, because Ike will soon be back. But there is a present I have for you, Rangy. Will you take it?" "What is it, Blue Eyes?" "Nothing but that saddle you're lying upon. If you look in the saddlebags you will find $10,000 there in gold." Miss Dick rose to her feet and made as though to slip once more into the darkness of the cave. But Rangy rose to his elbow, and by the mere strength of his purpose he compelled her to remain. "Talkin' about trumps, little girl, you shore is the most wonderful trump that ever got into a pack. Why are you doing this for me, little girl? Why are you letting me get away, when you might keep me here? Is that the only reason, girl?" "No, it shore ain't," the girl mimicked, and Rangy fancied that back of her mimicry there was a catch in her voice. "I am doing it because I didn't want you to think too badly of me, Rangy, after I am gone. I wanted you to know that I didn't steal it for myself, but just to help a friend of mine. You know who. Merrill hasn't played the game with him, and when I heard about this 10,000. You can do the rest. Ike is coming. We must hurry, Rangy. I did it because... Close your eyes, Rangy, and I will tell you the other reason." In a strange whim of obedience, as though the spell of the girl were about him, Rangy Pete closed his eyes. It was wonderful to feel thus her presence about him. It was almost a denial to the threat of farewell that he should now sense the thrill of her form hovering above him. Then he felt the swift warmth of her lips upon his fevered forehead. Rangy threw out his arms to catch her in his grasp, but when his arms closed again, there was no human form within them. He opened his eyes only to see the girl standing some paces from him. Rangy could not see her face, but he knew that the eyes must be sparkling, and the ripple of laughter which reached him through the darkness carried with it a message of gladness. With a fevered effort, he struggled into a sitting posture, but Miss Dick was vanishing into the darkness of the inner cave, and already there was the rattling sound of Ike Collander's return. "Come back, little Blue Eyes," he called out in a clear, thin voice, "for there's something I got to say to you, and I'll be waiting." Collander stepped forward to his side in a startled way. "What's that you're saying, Rangy?" he asked in a worried voice. "You think you're a talking to somebody?" "Was I talkin'?" Rangy asked, with but little of the old vitality in his tones. "You mustn't mind me, Ike, 'cause I sometimes get queer ideas in my head. And Ike, I'm awful glad you come." With that, Rangy Pete sank back upon the improvised bed which Miss Dick had made for him, and he closed his eyes as though in yielding to the blackness of suffering. Then Collander put a hand to his brow. "Fever. Running hot," he pronounced. "We shore did get here just in time. He couldn't a fought off them Merrill buckos much longer." But Rangy shifted restlessly. "Fever nothing," he declared, though with a palpable effort to keep control of his senses. "Can't a fellow think but what you've gotta call it fever? I suppose I gotta keep my eyes open now." Rangy's eyes did remain open, staring fixedly into the darkness at the roof of the cave, and while they stared, the brain back of them was recalling the picture of Miss Dick, the bandit, who had entrusted to his care some $10,000 in stolen gold. But she had not stolen it for herself. For a time the thrill of that almost drove the fever from his blood. At length, after long starings into the blackness, Rangy nodded his head sharply. The girl's purpose was clear, though the motive back of it might still be shrouded in the darkness of night. "Ike," he called suddenly, still with that struggling grip upon his senses, "Ring'em Foster come with you? Is Stipples and Dan Merrill there?" "They wasn't here when I got in with Ring'em, or we mighta had a real scrap, but they both come since. They was riding together in a posse." Rangy stared again as though his faculties were laboring. "You come with Ring'em?" he asked. "How come that you and Ring'em herded up together? You mean to say it was you sloped out and told Foster what was going on?" Collander's simple and somewhat shamed nod was the only answer. "Good ole Ike," Rangy muttered. "But your work ain't done yet. You bring them three persons up here." Through a period of fevered gripping at his flitting senses, Rangy lay back and struggled with this problem before him. Miss Dick had stolen, and yet she had not stolen. She had more nearly played the part of a Robin Hood, through some strange cycle of events which his imagination could not penetrate. Miss Dick and Ring'em Foster must fit somewhere into the patchwork of the past, but the problem of that was too much for his tortured brain, particularly when it brought with it a throb of pain which almost deadened the memory of that warm kiss upon his brow. Things at the best were topsy-turvy. The one thing of which he could be certain was that it was the girl who had warned Ring'em Foster many nights ago to travel to Triple Butte and collect $10,000 from Dan Merrill. The threads leading up to that did not matter. The money, by the application of all moral codes, really belonged to Foster, and Miss Dick had just been playing the role of a Robin Hood. Playing it for the sake of Ring'em Foster. The thought of that was torment. Still, she had helped to check up the debt-dodging Dan Merrill, and now, that was the sound of Merrill's querulous voice as the three men made their way up the face of the cliff. There was a tramping of feet, the mockery of Merrill's sneering laughter, and when Rangy opened his eyes, the three men stood there in the shadows of the moonlight, looking down upon him. In the background was Ike Collander, looking wistfully at Rangy Pete, and with a huge derringer dangling at his right hip. Ike was bending upon Rangy many reassuring nods. He tapped the derringer significantly. "Well, Stipples, you got him at last," Merrill barked in a vicious voice whose echoes rumbled and moaned their way into the inner caverns. "Got him, Stipples, all nicked up as he should be. Now, you highwaymen, don't you see how the tables can turn?" Rangy Pete blinked up through the shifting moonlight. "Kinda drag me out to the edge of the cave where I can see your faces better." He spoke almost tonelessly. "That's all right. Now, you three gents, set back there in a row. Stipples, you get between them two mavericks. No, you'd better unlimber their guns." Merrill broke in with contemptuous laughter. "What horseplay is this?" he demanded. "I'll line up for nobody. Stipples, put that fool under arrest, and we'll drag him out to Triple Butte." Though it cost him an effort, Rangy forced a smile to his lips. "If you're taking a tip from me, Merrill," he spoke softly, "you'll be kinda hankering in about a minute or two for Ring'em not to have a gun in his fingers. Now you gonna give up the hardware to Stipples?" For the first time, it seemed, Merrill sensed something dramatic in the background. Still he blustered violently as he handed his weapons to Stipples. "I'm here to get you for finishing off Sonnes," he threatened ominously, "but it don't matter whether it's me or Stipples who arrests you. You finished Sonnes 'cause Smithers saw you." "Is that right, Rangy?" Ring'em Foster spoke for the first time. His voice was cool and deliberate, and in that instant, because of the man's calmness, Rangy lost some of his wonder at the seeming peace between Merrill and Foster. It was not peace, it was instead the reserve of judgment. "Shore thing," Rangy agreed, "and when you hear about it, you'll be giving me a medal." "You see?" Merrill bellowed his interruption. "He admits it. We'd better string him up now, Ring'em." Rangy raised his hand, and Ike Collander stepped swiftly to his side, his eyes glaring with a hardness rarely seen upon his flaccid countenance. "That's all right, Ike," Rangy soothed. "We ain't here to talk about Sonnes. Leastways, not till we finished that little talk what Ring'em and Dan and me started in Tony Burke's back room a night or so ago. Don't go to jerking that way, Dan. Ring'em ain't got any guns on him. You remember, Dan, you didn't know anything about $10,000 that night, what somebody wrote Ring'em to collect." Merrill's features had abruptly lost the most of their arrogance. The man's eyes darted swiftly from side to side, and for an instant they looked frantically out into the moonlight, as though he were considering the wisdom of hurried flight. "There ain't no getting away from here, Dan," Rangy went on in weaker tones, "'cause Ike's standing over you with a derringer. Now, Stipples, you just go to looking into these saddlebags." Stipples, the astounded, did as instructed. When the yellow coins began to slither out into the moonlight, Merrill reached forward with animal swiftness. But Foster stood before him. "Where did you find that, Rangy?" he asked crisply. "In a box of 'vaporated apples what Dan had shipped in from the East. There's 10,000 there, but you mustn't do anything rough, Ring'em, 'cause Dan ain't done anything but double cross you, same as he's been doing with everybody else. You can't expect him to be paying his debts when he's been saving up the yellow boys like this to skip the country." Rangy paused because of the ominous calm which settled down upon them. In that instant, Ring'em Foster reached swiftly for his 6-gun, but finding only the empty holster, he dropped his hand with a gesture of disgust. Then he stepped quickly forward and looked fairly into Merrill's shrinking eyes. "Remember what I told you, Merrill." Foster's voice came harsh and crisp. "I told you that if you were trying to double cross me, there wouldn't be enough punchers at the Snaky Y to save your hide. Now, what you got to say for yourself?" Merrill's only answer was a grasping of the fingers towards that pile of glittering gold. "It's not yours," Foster spoke with firm decision, "and you'll never get your hands on it again. Stipples, take charge of it. And now you, Merrill, what have you to say?" For a time the man blustered, then he attempted subterfuge. "Shore, I'll pay it all to you, Foster," he whined. "You know I had to find some way to get it into the country." "To double cross me, you mean?" Foster's tones had become deadly. Stipples, give us back our guns. One each." "My God, no!" Merrill's thick tones had become a scream. "Not that, Foster. I ain't in shape. You know that. I been drinking." Foster's contemptuous glance held him through a moment of fear. "I've got 10,000 more back at the Snaky Y," Merrill's shaky voice went on. "That'll straighten up everything, Ring'em, and I'll go square. Honest to God, I will." Dark purpose came into Foster's gaze. "The guns, Stipples." Stipples, whether dominated by Foster's commanding manner or through sudden contempt for Merrill, began to reach out the guns slowly, one towards each man. Foster reached out for his weapon, but Merrill, with a gurgling in his throat, struck out savagely and knocked his own gun from Stipples' hand. "God, Foster, I'll square everything," he pleaded in a thickened voice. "Not that." "We know you'll square everything, one way or the other." Foster's tones were relentless. "It's this way, Merrill, gun to gun, or it's out of the butte country for you, and out of it forever. Get that? Stay here with all the lead I can put into you, or out you go." Merrill swung about swiftly. "I'll go," he whined. "I'll go tonight. Let me go back to the Snaky Y. I'll turn everything over to Stipples, to square things." "You've been a crook, haven't you, Merrill?" Foster demanded unpityingly. "You've been trying to double cross everybody, to pile up a nice little fortune to skip the country with. Isn't that so?" Merrill's blood-drained features became suddenly suffused with passion. He struggled for words, but they would not come. "True or not true?" Foster insisted menacingly. "My God, man," Merrill moaned, "you can't expect me to say that." Foster edged a trifle closer. "You were debt dodging and piling up money to skip," he charged. "True or not true? No quibbling." Foster's gaze was a compelling one. It was hard and cold with all the struggle of years, and now it was dominating as well. Abruptly Merrill swept a hand before his face as though fearing a blow. "It's true," he gulped. "But I'll square everything. Honest to heaven I will, Ring'em." "You bet you will," Foster pronounced grimly. "And then what will you do?" Merrill cringed abjectly, in sudden haste to oblige. "I'll get out of the country." Ring'em Foster nodded sharply. "It'd be a whole lot better if you'd shoot it out with me," he returned peevishly. "It might save some other gent the trouble of perforating you." "All right, Stipples, gather up that yellow stuff. If he won't be shot, we gotta put up with it, and escort him over the state line. March pronto, you gents. We'll get out of here." Through the routine of departure, Ring'em Foster went to stand for a moment over the improvised couch of Rangy Pete. The latter's eyes, he could see, were dull, and there was the flush of fever upon his cheeks. Rangy moved restlessly, and made as though to speak, but Foster waved him into silence. "It's all right, Rangy, whatever it is," he said. "You shore done a good day's work, and we ain't gonna forget it." Rangy's eyes drifted towards the blackness of the cave. He tried again to speak, then suddenly he sank back into the vague land of darkness. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of Rangy Pete by Guy Morton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. After an eternal period of burning torment and fantastic visions, through which his brain seemed never to rest, Rangy opened his eyes weakly and stared listlessly about him. The scene was a strange one, but nothing really mattered anyway. There were drab shadows all about, which appeared to have no part in the life he had always lived. And there was a man sitting in front of him, with back turned, and working at something which Rangy could not see. Something remotely familiar about that back appealed to Rangy's dulled brain and held the weak gaze of his eyes. It didn't matter. Still, he would like to know what that person was doing there. Rangy shifted in his position and was about to speak when the man suddenly turned upon him. "Jumpin' Jericho!" that individual exclaimed gladly. "You really got your peepers open again, Rangy? I been wonderin' if you was ever going to consent to look on this wicked world again. Here's something for you to drink. A friend of yours brought it." Ike Collander placed something to his lips and Rangy promptly dozed into slumber again. But this time it was sleep without those tormenting visions. When he wakened again, his brain was much clearer and his limbs felt less leaden. The fingers of his memory began to toy with the past, and there was a vague appreciation of the fact that all things were not exactly as he would have them. There was this cave and Ike Collander, patient Ike Collander, whose services in a time of need were a pleasing thing. But there was something lacking. In time his memory pieced together those ragged patches of the past, and he knew just where the story of his life had broken. "Ike, how long have I been here?" he asked at length. "It's 5 days since you turned your nose to the wall and wouldn't recognize anybody," Collander informed, with a sort of motherish hovering about him. "But you're right now as a grass-fed maverick, and in about 10 days we'll be hitting it back for Triple Butte." "Where's the rest of the army, and what's happened?" Rangy insisted. "Nothing happened," Collander chuckled, "though Ring'em did have kind of a hard time to keep them Snaky Y buckos from stringing up Dan Merrill when they heard he'd been planning to skip out and leave them all howling for their wages. But nothing happened. They went through the pass together, the Snaky Y and the Triangle O and the Double K, and they mooched around a couple of days looking for Dervishers." "And they didn't find a single Dervisher?" Rangy asked anxiously. "Shore you ain't lying to me, Ike?" "Honest to goodness, they didn't find so much as hide or hair of a lone Dervisher," Collander informed hurriedly. "But you should see the way them Snaky Y boys knuckle to Ring'em. They ain't no good without a leader." Rangy leaned back with a sigh of relief. Miss Dick, it became obvious, was completely able to look after herself. Yet in doing that, it left a sort of aching void about the heart. "Jumbo Irish is coming back in about a week or 10 days with a couple of cayuses to pack you out," Collander went on. "They left us a lot of grub, and now you've got nothing to do but pick up and get to feeling yourself again." Ike Collander broke off abruptly, and instead of returning to that unknown task of his, he stood looking down upon Rangy Pete in a curious way. "You're a funny one, Rangy," he blurted out at last. "Who is the lady?" "What lady?" Rangy's question was almost an explosion of sound. "Don't stand there, Ike, trying to be mysterious, but go on and tell me." Ike considered a moment as though attempting to find the proper lead. "The lady what comes to see you each night just at dusk," he informed in the end. "It's queer, just like one of them romances what I seen once on the stage. She comes outa the dark of this cave every night, sits with you for an hour, gets some things to eat offen me, and then she goes back again." "Is she coming tonight, Ike?" Rangy demanded excitedly. "I dunno. She said to me once that she'd come as long as you're unconscious." "Then, Ike, I'm gonna be unconscious tonight, dead to the world, and don't you dare tell her anything different. And when you see her coming, you smooch it outa the way." Rangy's fever ran high all through that afternoon, and as he tried to count the minutes, it seemed to him that time never before had dragged along on such leaden feet. There was an insistent demand that Miss Dick should come, and that demand was leavened by the constant fear that she would not. There was the danger that she might know of his returning consciousness, that she may have heard Ike Collander talking to him. There were menaces which, in the mind of a sick man, will become warped and magnified until in the end the whole world seems distorted. Through the dragging hours Rangy Pete waited with what patience he could, and when at length the fading light of the sun permitted a grayness to creep into the blue of that thin patch of skyline showing beyond the lip of the cave, his doubts grew more at ease, and he began to picture just what Miss Dick would look like when she crept out of the darkness of the cave and came to sit by his side. It was by an effort of the will alone that he was able to close his eyes, but shortly he found that it was more restful to practice thus the feigning of unconsciousness. Yet it was in one of those moments that the girl came to him, so that in the end he did not see her stealing out of the darkness. The first he knew of her presence was the light touch of her fingers upon his forehead. Those fingers were cool and soft and mothering, and their faintest touch was a caress through which he fancied he could read all manner of glad tidings. He was wondering if that possessiveness in the girl's touch were but his sick imagining. Then he heard her voice, pitched low, yet touched with rebuke. "His fever is higher tonight. What have you been doing to him, Ike?" "Nothing, miss," Collander evaded. He seemed to be tossing about a bit this afternoon, and that makes me think he'll soon be coming to. You sure, Ike, you haven't been trying to feed him something he shouldn't have, or something like that?" "Nary a thing, Miss," Ike protested. Then shortly he rose and found some excuse to slip down over the mouth of the cave to the ground below. With Miss Dick so near him, with her mothering fingers gently stroking the fever from his brow, and with the faint little crooning of a song upon her lips, Rangy found this assumed pose of unconsciousness a difficult thing to maintain. He wondered that she did not hear the fevered beating of his heart. Then shortly he wondered if it were fair to take advantage of her in this manner. He wondered so long that at length one eye slipped open just a trifle, and he peered through the twilight at the girl's face. The acuteness of his gaze must have carried its own message to the girl's senses, for shortly the song died upon her lips and she leaned forward eagerly. There was such anxiety in her attitude that Rangy found his pose an objectionable thing, so he opened his eyes wide and stared up into her face. Miss Dick gave a little cry which was all gladness. "Ike," she called. "Here, you, Ike Collander. Come here at once. He's awake." Rangy grinned to the limit of his capacity, though he felt it was an absurd thing to do. "They's no use calling Ike," he declared, "for I've been awake all afternoon, and he knows it. I told him to smooch it out of the way, 'cause there's something I want to say to you, little Blue Eyes." "Then you've been fooling me by pretending to be unconscious?" the girl demanded with a faint suggestion of hauteur. But Rangy's eyes held a pleading message aimed to destroy the aloofness of any feminine dignity. "Yes, little girl, 'cause I knew I could never get along without you. I knew nothing would ever be the same again if you didn't come tonight. And since I been feeling your fingers on my forehead, little Blue Eyes, I know I ain't never going to lose you again." There was much more of it. There were so many gentle words falling from Rangy's lips that at length the girl's eyes grew softer and deeper from their peering into the future, and when she leaned just a trifle closer, the man's arms raised and clasped about her neck. For a very short space of time, Miss Dick resisted the pressure of his arms, then slowly, gently, she yielded to their caress. "But how can you ask me to marry you, Rangy?" she asked, some time later, when the sparkle was still showing in her eyes. "How can you, when you know I am just a bandit, and when you know nothing more about me?" "There is nothing more I want to know, little Blue Eyes, except that you are you. You got a right to be a bandit if you want to be one." "But you were going to teach me something about the code of man," the girl reminded, with the gladness of laughter upon her lips. "The code of man?" Rangy wondered. "Say, Blue Eyes, the code of man what I was a gonna teach you ain't nothin' compared to the code of woman what you've taught me. If you was brought up a bandit, you shore have been a square one." "Yes, Rangy, I was brought up a bandit," the girl broke in, with reflective tones in her voice which seemed to say there were new phases of life just opening before her. "Dervisher Dick is my daddy, and I have never known anything else but living in the hills. I never knew until lately that it was really wrong to live as the Dervishers live. But a little while ago a man came along and taught me some of the new things of life which I never knew before. And now you "Another man?" Rangy demanded, with a pain in his voice which no woman could ever have mistaken. "You don't mean, Blue Eyes, that there's another man?" "Another man taught me the first things I ever knew about right and wrong," the girl whispered. "He came into the hills, and I met him by chance. He was so nice and kind, and I owe him an awful lot." A slight groan slipped from Rangy's lips. "Please don't," he muttered. "I don't think I can stand it." "I think you can," the girl went on, "for you know him, Rangy, and you too owe something to him. I am going to tell you the man's name. He is Ring'em Foster. You remember how his punchers got me out of the Burke saloon that night when I was foolish and wanted to see something of life?" The sick man's eyes had become pained, like those of a wounded animal, and yet they looked up into her face firmly, with a rebellious faith. "And you love Ring'em?" he whispered wistfully. Miss Dick laughed in a curious way. "Love him? Why, no. I think of him as another daddy. He was so kind to me." The balance of the sentence was quite smothered in the folds of Rangy's arms, and this time there was not even the faintest suggestion of resistance in the girl's manner. "Funny, ain't it? Rangy laughed gladly after a few delirious minutes had raced away. "That I'm gonna take you back to Triple Butte after all, and that you are going to teach to me the code of man?" the girl whispered. "But is there no danger for you from the Snaky Y?" Rangy Pete was too glad to see in the future anything but the rose of promise. "Danger?" he laughed. "They're eating out of Ring'em's hand, and I'm thinking when they know all about it, you can have most anything you want around Triple Butte." "But we won't bother with the butte. We'll get a little ranch of our own." "Where you can teach me that code?" the girl interrupted laughingly. "There ain't anything to teach you," Rangy returned somewhat humbly, "for there'd have to be a whole lot more in that code than I ever knew of for it to be big enough to hold a patch to the code of woman. Now, Blue Eyes, let's take a peek into the future. You are tired now, Rangy boy. Tomorrow, if you are good, we will talk, and we will plan for the days when you are strong again." The man sank back, weary from the joy of it all, while the girl leaned above him once more, her lips forming the crooning words of that melody of love, which is as old as life itself. End of chapter 14. End of Rangy Pete by Guy Morton.